The morning light streamed through the dusty window of Sarah Mitchell's one-bedroom apartment as she packed the last of her essentials into a weathered suitcase. At 34, Sarah's life had become a carefully constructed routine. Wake up at 5:30 a.m., work her shift at Meadowbrook Nursing Home until 3 p.m., come home to her empty apartment and repeat. For 7 years, this had been her life, comfortable in its predictability, if not particularly exciting. Today was different. The small envelope on her dresser contained a one-way ticket to San Francisco, a city she'd never visited and knew only from images on the internet and old movies. Her younger sister Ellie was getting married, and despite Sarah's tight budget and aversion to travel, some occasions demanded sacrifices. "You can do this," Sarah whispered to her reflection, tucking a strand of mousy brown hair behind her ear. The woman staring back at her looked tired, with soft lines around her eyes that spoke of years of gentle smiles and quiet disappointments. Her wardrobe consisted mostly of practical scrubs and comfortable shoes, the uniform of someone who had chosen to care for others rather than indulge herself. The taxi ride to the airport was spent in silence, Sarah clutching her purse with the remainder of her savings. $327 would have to last her the entire week in California. She'd calculated every expense meticulously, leaving just enough for a small wedding gift for Ellie. The familiar knot of anxiety tightened in her chest as the taxi pulled up to the departures terminal. Boston Logan Airport buzzed with activity, a chaotic symphony of announcements, rolling suitcases, and hurried conversations. Sarah felt immediately out of place, like a small-town librarian who had accidentally wandered onto a busy highway. She clutched her boarding pass, rechecking her gate number for the 5th time in as many minutes. "Excuse me, miss?" The voice came from behind her, gentle but firm. Sarah turned to see a middle-aged woman in an airline uniform. "Would you be willing to switch seats? We have a passenger with special requirements who needs an aisle seat with extra room." Sarah glanced at her boarding pass. She'd specifically requested a window seat, hoping to distract herself from the anxiety of flying by watching the clouds. But years of putting others' needs before her own had conditioned her response. "Of course," she said, forcing a smile. "No problem at all. Thank you so much. You'll be in 14C now next to Mr. Calloway. We appreciate your understanding." The attendant handed her a new boarding pass and moved on to handle the next crisis of the day. Boarding commenced 30 minutes later. Sarah waited patiently in line, watching as first-class passengers and those needing special assistance were invited to board first. Among them was a man in a wheelchair, perhaps in his early 40s, with broad shoulders and a commanding presence despite his seated position. His salt and pepper hair was neatly trimmed, and he wore an expensive-looking charcoal suit that seemed at odds with the casual attire of other travelers. Something about his profile caught Sarah's attention, a strong jawline, thoughtful eyes focused on something in the distance. When an attendant pushed his wheelchair down the jetway, Sarah noticed how he gripped the armrests tightly, as if asserting that he was merely allowing the assistance, not requiring it. By the time Sarah boarded and found 14C, the man from the wheelchair was already situated in 14A, the window seat. Somehow she'd expected him to take the aisle, given the earlier seat change, but perhaps the airline had rearranged multiple passengers. A heavy-set businessman occupied 14B, already spreading into her assigned space. "Excuse me," Sarah said softly, indicating she needed to get past. The businessman sighed dramatically and half stood, allowing her to squeeze past him. She settled into 14C, arranged her small bag under the seat in front of her, and tried to make herself as compact as possible, her shoulder nearly touching the man by the window. "They always overbook these flights," the businessman complained to no one in particular, unfolding a newspaper that invaded Sarah's limited space. Sarah said nothing, keeping her eyes forward. She'd taken 2 shifts of overtime to afford this flight, and she wasn't going to let anything spoil it, even if that meant enduring 4 hours squeezed between 2 strangers. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing a slight delay due to air traffic. Sarah closed her eyes, practicing the breathing exercises her doctor had recommended for her anxiety. In, 2, 3, 4, out, 2, 3, 4. First time flying? The question came from her left, from the man by the window. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, with a slight accent she couldn't place. Sarah opened her eyes and turned to face him. Up close, she noticed the fine lines around his eyes. Laugh lines, her grandmother would have called them. His eyes were a striking shade of blue, almost too intense. "No," she answered. "Just not a fan." He smiled, and Sarah noticed how it transformed his face, softening the serious expression he'd worn earlier. "Me neither, actually. Ironic, given how much I travel." "Work?" Sarah asked, surprising herself with her willingness to engage. Small talk wasn't usually her forte, especially with strangers. "Mostly," he replied. "I'm a consultant for medical technology companies. And you? What brings you to San Francisco?" "My sister's wedding," Sarah said, grateful for the simple question that required no elaboration. The businessman between them shifted irritably, clearly annoyed by the conversation happening across his personal space. The man by the window seemed to notice and reached into the seat pocket in front of him, retrieving a small envelope. "I wonder," he said, loud enough for the businessman to hear, "if you might help me with something important when we're in the air. I'd hate to bother our friend in the middle seat for the entire flight." The businessman huffed and buried himself deeper in his newspaper. Sarah raised an eyebrow, curious about what help this stranger might need. But before she could ask, the plane began to move, and her attention shifted to controlling her anxiety as they taxied toward the runway. The takeoff was smooth, or as smooth as hurtling down a runway at 180 miles per hour in a metal tube could be. Sarah gripped the armrests, her knuckles white, only relaxing when the ping of the seatbelt sign turning off indicated they'd reached cruising altitude. The businessman immediately stood up. "I'm heading to the bathroom and then I'm going to see if they'll move me somewhere else. This is ridiculous." He squeezed past Sarah and disappeared down the aisle. "I think we scared him off," the man by the window said with a wink. "I'm James, by the way. James Calloway." "Sarah Mitchell," she replied, offering a tentative smile. "And I don't think it was us. I think it was the idea of being a go-between for an entire flight." James laughed, a warm sound that seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the airplane. "True, though I wasn't entirely making that up. I really could use some help." He gestured to the envelope he'd taken out earlier. "Would you mind holding this for a moment?" Sarah took the envelope, surprised by its weight. It was made of thick, expensive paper, sealed with what appeared to be wax, like something from another era. "I can't open it properly with one hand," James explained. And for the first time, Sarah noticed that his right arm lay immobile on the armrest, the hand curled slightly inward. "Old war injury," he added, seeing her gaze. "Usually manageable, but it acts up at the most inconvenient times." Sarah's nursing instincts kicked in. "How long have you had it?" 12 years. Afghanistan. I was a combat medic." Sarah nodded, processing this information. It explained the commanding presence, the way he held himself. "I'm a nurse," she offered, "at a nursing home in Boston." "I thought you might be in healthcare," James said. "You have the look." "The look?" "Kind eyes, patient hands. The way you automatically check the exit rows during boarding, assessing your environment, making mental notes of safety procedures, classic medical training." Sarah felt a flutter of something unfamiliar. Was it flattery? It had been so long since anyone had noticed anything about her beyond her ability to change bedpans and administer medications on schedule. "You're observant," she said. "I've had to be." James gestured to his legs. "When half your body decides to stop cooperating, you learn to pay attention to everything else with double the intensity." This explained the wheelchair, though Sarah noted he spoke of his condition matter-of-factly, without self-pity. She respected that. Working in geriatric care, she'd seen how differently people handled physical limitations. Some with grace, others with bitterness. "Could you open that for me?" James asked, nodding toward the envelope still in her hands. Sarah carefully broke the wax seal and removed the contents, a thick stack of what appeared to be architectural drawings and a smaller sealed envelope. "I'm helping design a new rehabilitation center in San Francisco," James explained. "Those are the latest revisions from my team. I need to review them before my meeting tomorrow." Sarah handed him the drawings but held on to the smaller envelope, unsure if he wanted her to open that as well. Their fingers brushed during the exchange, and Sarah felt an unexpected warmth spread up her arm. She quickly attributed it to the cabin's stuffy air. James studied the drawings intently, his brow furrowed in concentration. Sarah found herself studying him in turn, the way his eyes moved methodically across the page, the slight tilt of his head as he considered something, the gentle tap of his functioning left hand as he counted dimensions in his mind. "What do you think?" he asked suddenly, turning the drawings toward her. Startled, Sarah looked at the complex plans. "I'm not an architect." "No, but you're a nurse. This is a rehabilitation facility. Would this layout work for patients? For staff? The architects can make anything look good on paper, but I need to know if it's functional." Sarah hesitated, then leaned closer to examine the drawings. The businessman had not returned, giving her space to shift toward James. She found herself pointing out issues that immediately jumped out at her. Storage areas too far from patient rooms, nursing stations with obstructed views, hallways too narrow for two wheelchairs to pass comfortably. James listened intently, occasionally making notes in the margins with his left hand. "This is exactly what I needed," he said after she'd gone through several pages. "Someone who sees it from the practical side. My team is brilliant with theories and aesthetics, but sometimes they forget the human element." "I'm just pointing out what seems obvious," Sarah said, uncomfortable with the praise. "That's precisely why it's valuable. What's obvious to you is invisible to them." James smiled warmly. "You've just saved us months of post-construction modifications." The flight attendant arrived with the beverage cart, interrupting their conversation. James ordered a sparkling water. Sarah asked for orange juice. When the businessman didn't return to claim his drink, the attendant shrugged and moved on. "I think we've been officially abandoned," James said with another smile. "Would you mind?" He gestured to the middle seat. Sarah moved over, grateful for the additional space. Sitting directly next to James felt both more comfortable and somehow more intimate. She was suddenly aware of the faint scent of his cologne, something woodsy and expensive. "So, your sister's getting married," James said, returning to their earlier conversation. "Older or younger?" "Younger, by 6 years." "And you're not married?" The question was direct but not judgmental. Sarah shook her head. "Never came close, really." She wasn't sure why she was being so candid with a stranger, but something about James invited honesty. "That surprises me," he said thoughtfully. "Why? You don't know me." "I know enough." James took a sip of his water. "You're intelligent, observant, caring. You put others before yourself, evidenced by your career choice and the fact that you gave up your window seat without complaint. You notice details others miss. These are rare qualities." Sarah felt her cheeks warm. Compliments were as foreign to her as exotic cuisine. "You've constructed quite a character profile from a 30-minute conversation." "It's what I do. Observe, analyze, draw conclusions." James set his drink down. "I've gotten quite good at reading people quickly. It's essential in my line of work, and given my condition, I don't always have the luxury of time for lengthy introductions." There was something in his tone that made Sarah look at him more carefully. A hint of urgency, perhaps, or resignation. Before she could analyze it further, James handed her the smaller envelope. "Would you open this one too?" Sarah broke the seal on the second envelope and removed a single photograph. It showed a younger James, standing tall in military dress uniform, his arm around an elderly woman with his same striking blue eyes. "My grandmother," James explained. "She raised me after my parents died. That was taken the day before I deployed." "She looks proud," Sarah observed, noting the woman's beaming smile. She was, and worried sick, though she tried not to show it. James took the photo, his expression softening. "She died while I was overseas. Before," he gestured to his legs, "before this happened. Sometimes I think that was a blessing. It would have broken her heart to see me come home like this." "I'm sorry," Sarah said simply, knowing from years of nursing that sometimes the simplest acknowledgments of pain were the most sincere. James tucked the photo carefully into his suit pocket. "Life has a way of taking unexpected turns. I've learned to navigate the new path rather than mourn the old one." They fell into comfortable conversation as the plane continued westward. James told her about his work developing technologies to help people with disabilities live more independently. Sarah shared stories about her patients at Meadowbrook, the small victories that made her job worthwhile. They discovered a shared love of classic films and an equal distaste for reality television. The ease of their interaction surprised Sarah. It had been years since she'd connected with someone so quickly, if ever. There was something both familiar and exhilarating about talking to James, as though they'd known each other for years while simultaneously discovering something new with each exchange. 2 hours into the flight, during a brief lull in their conversation, James looked out the window at the vast expanse of clouds below. "I want to tell you something that's going to sound completely insane," he said, his voice taking on a serious tone. Sarah felt a flutter of anxiety. Here it was, the moment when this seemingly perfect interaction would reveal itself as something else. Perhaps he was going to try to sell her something or recruit her into some weird organization or, "I think I want to marry you, Sarah Mitchell." The world seemed to stop. Sarah blinked, certain she had misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" James turned away from the window, his blue eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I said, I think I want to marry you. And I realize how that sounds coming from a stranger on an airplane, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life." Sarah stared at James, waiting for the punchline. When none came, she laughed nervously, the sound brittle even to her own ears. "That's quite a joke," she said, glancing around to see if anyone else had heard his outlandish statement. James didn't laugh. His expression remained earnest, his blue eyes never leaving her face. "I'm not joking, Sarah. I know it sounds impulsive, maybe even crazy, but I've spent my life making calculated decisions. This is the first time in years I've felt absolutely certain about something that defies logic." Sarah shifted uncomfortably in her seat. Had she completely misread this man? Was he unstable? The thought sent a chill through her, trapped as she was in a metal tube 35,000 feet above the earth with nowhere to escape. "You don't know me," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "And I don't know you. Marriage is a serious commitment, not something you propose to a stranger during a flight." James nodded, acknowledging her point. "You're right. It sounds irrational, and I've always prided myself on being rational. But hear me out." He paused, seeming to collect his thoughts. "I've been alone for a long time, Sarah, not just without a partner, but truly alone. My work, my disability, they've isolated me in ways I never anticipated." He glanced down at his immobile right hand. "After I was injured, I threw myself into my work. It was easier than facing what I'd lost. I designed technologies, built a company, accumulated wealth and accolades, and came home every night to an empty house that felt more like a museum than a home." Despite her wariness, Sarah felt a pang of recognition. Hadn't she done the same? Buried herself in her work, in caring for others, to avoid examining the emptiness of her own life? "Last year," James continued, I was diagnosed with a degenerative condition affecting my nervous system. It's progressive. The doctors give me perhaps 5 good years before the deterioration becomes significant." He said this matter-of-factly, without self-pity. It made me reevaluate everything. What matters, what doesn't. What I want from the time I have left. Sarah's nursing instincts kicked in, her mind automatically cataloging his symptoms, considering potential diagnoses. But the personal implications of what he was saying struck her more profoundly. 5 years. Such a cruelly specific time frame. "I'm sorry," she said, and meant it. "But that still doesn't explain this." She gestured between them. "Doesn't it?" James's expression softened. "When I saw you in the boarding area, the way you helped that elderly woman with her bag, how you stepped aside to let the harried mother with twins go ahead of you, I observed someone with a natural kindness that can't be faked. During our conversation, I've discovered someone intelligent, insightful, and genuinely caring. Someone who sees me as a person, not as a condition or a bank account." He leaned slightly closer. "I'm not asking you to say yes this moment. I'm asking you to consider the possibility, to spend time with me in San Francisco, to let me show you who I am beyond this brief encounter, and maybe to consider a future that neither of us expected when we boarded this plane." Sarah felt dizzy, overwhelmed by his words and the intensity behind them. Part of her, a small, reckless part she barely recognized, was intrigued. But the practical, cautious Sarah, who had navigated life safely for 34 years, was sounding alarm bells. "This is insane," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Perhaps," James agreed, "but sometimes the most meaningful decisions in life appear insane at first glance." He reached into his jacket and withdrew a business card, offering it to her. "Here's my contact information. I'm staying at the Palace Hotel while in San Francisco. Think about it. That's all I ask." Sarah took the card reflexively, noting the embossed lettering. James Calloway, CEO, Calloway Adaptive Technologies. The company name rang a bell. She'd read about their breakthrough work in prosthetics and mobility aids in one of her nursing journals. "I have commitments in San Francisco," she said, finding her voice. "My sister's wedding, family obligations." "Of course, I wouldn't dream of interfering with those, but perhaps afterwards or between events, a coffee, a dinner, a chance to see if this unusual meeting might lead somewhere real." Before Sarah could respond, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing their initial descent into San Francisco. As if on cue, the businessman who had abandoned them earlier appeared, reclaiming his middle seat with minimal acknowledgement of their existence. The spell of intimate conversation was broken. Sarah moved back to her assigned seat, her mind reeling. The business card in her hand felt impossibly heavy, as if the weight of potential futures was contained in its glossy surface. For the remainder of the flight, they spoke little, the businessman's presence creating a barrier between them. But Sarah felt James's gaze on her occasionally, thoughtful and patient. As the plane touched down at San Francisco International Airport, Sarah's thoughts were nowhere near her sister's wedding. Instead, she was mentally cataloging the impossibilities of what James was suggesting. She had a life in Boston, an apartment, a job, responsibilities. He was clearly wealthy, accustomed to a world entirely different from her own. And then there was his health condition, which would eventually require intensive care. As a nurse, she knew better than most what that entailed. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Around them, passengers stood, retrieving bags from overhead compartments, eager to deplane. James remained seated, waiting for the aisle to clear. "They'll bring my wheelchair to the door," he explained when Sarah glanced at him questioningly. "I always board first and deplane last, one of the many perks of my condition." His wry smile invited her to appreciate the irony rather than pity him. Sarah hesitated. Should she wait with him? Would that imply a level of commitment to his outlandish proposal? "You don't need to wait," James said, reading her indecision. "I know you have family expecting you." Indeed, Ellie had texted during landing, confirming she was waiting at arrivals. Sarah nodded gratefully, gathering her belongings. "It was interesting meeting you, Mr. Calloway," she said formally, suddenly shy. "James, please. And likewise, Sarah Mitchell." He held her gaze for a moment longer than was comfortable. "I hope our paths cross again during your stay." Sarah managed a non-committal smile, then made her way down the aisle toward the exit, feeling his eyes on her back the entire way. Only when she stepped off the plane did she realize she was still clutching his business card. The arrivals area was a chaos of reunions, families embracing, children squealing, lovers kissing as if they'd been separated for years rather than hours. Amidst this sea of emotion, Sarah spotted her sister immediately. Ellie was her physical opposite, petite where Sarah was tall, blonde where Sarah was brunette, outgoing where Sarah was reserved. Currently, she was jumping up and down, waving frantically. "Sarah, over here!" They embraced. Ellie chattering excitedly about wedding plans, last-minute changes, family dramas Sarah had missed. Sarah nodded at appropriate intervals, trying to focus, but her mind kept drifting back to the plane, to James and his extraordinary proposition. "Earth to Sarah. Are you jet-lagged already?" Ellie's voice cut through her thoughts. "I asked if you want to stop for coffee before we head to Mom and Dad's." "Sorry, yes. Coffee would be great." Sarah forced herself back to the present. The flight was unusual. Unusual how? Turbulence? Screaming babies? Chatty seatmate who wouldn't shut up? Ellie linked her arm through Sarah's as they walked toward the parking garage. "Something like that," Sarah murmured. How could she possibly explain what had happened? Even in her own mind, it seemed like a surreal dream. They stopped at a small cafe near the airport, Sarah nursing a latte while Ellie continued her wedding updates. The coffeehouse was cozy, with mismatched furniture and local artwork adorning the walls. Through the window, Sarah could see fog rolling in, shrouding the city in a mystical haze. San Francisco already felt different from Boston, more whimsical, less structured, a place where perhaps unusual things could happen. So anyway, the florist called yesterday and said they can't get the specific roses I wanted, but they can substitute with... Ellie stopped mid-sentence, squinting at Sarah. "You haven't heard a word I've said, have you? What's going on?" Sarah sighed, setting down her coffee cup. "Sorry, Elle. I met someone on the plane, and he said something that threw me off balance." Ellie's eyes widened, her wedding planning momentarily forgotten. "Met someone? Like romantically? You, Sarah? I'm too busy for dating, Mitchell." "It wasn't like that," Sarah protested. "Though wasn't it exactly like that? He was just, interesting. Interesting enough to distract you from my wedding drama? This I have to hear." Ellie leaned forward eagerly. "Spill everything. Is he cute? What does he do? Did you get his number?" Sarah hesitated, then reached into her purse and placed James's business card on the table between them. Ellie picked it up, whistling low when she read it. "CEO? Nice! And Callaway Adaptive Technologies. Wait, I know them. They make those super advanced prosthetics, right? David did a story on them last year." Ellie's fiancé was a technology journalist, always covering the latest innovations. "Yes, that's them," Sarah confirmed, surprised that her sister was familiar with the company. "So what did Mr. CEO say that has you so distracted?" Ellie handed the card back, her expression curious. Sarah took a deep breath. "He asked me to marry him." Ellie choked on her cappuccino, coughing violently. "He what?" "Proposed. Sort of. He said he wants to marry me, but he'd settle for coffee or dinner during my stay to see if there's something real between us." Saying it aloud made it sound even more preposterous. Ellie stared at her, mouth agape. "Are you serious? A complete stranger proposed to you on a plane? Was he drunk? High? Having a psychotic break?" "No, nothing like that. He was completely lucid, intelligent, articulate. He's in a wheelchair. An old war injury, he said, and he mentioned being recently diagnosed with some progressive condition. Sarah frowned, remembering the matter-of-fact way James had delivered this life-altering information. So what? He's looking for a nurse wife to take care of him? Ellie's tone was skeptical, protective. I don't think so, Sarah said slowly. It wasn't like that. He seemed sincere, like he genuinely felt some connection between us. Ellie studied her sister's face. And did you feel a connection? Sarah considered the question. Had she? There had been something, an ease of conversation, a sense of being truly seen for the first time in years. But was that a foundation for marriage? Or just the artificial intimacy of strangers on a plane, sharing confidences they might never have revealed in normal circumstances? I don't know, she admitted finally. It was all so unexpected. Well, are you going to call him? Meet him for that coffee? Ellie was watching her closely, the way she had when they were teenagers and Sarah was deliberating over some important decision. I haven't decided. It seems silly, doesn't it? To even consider it? Ellie surprised her by reaching across the table and squeezing her hand. Maybe. But when was the last time you did something unexpected, Sarah? Something just for yourself, not because it was practical or responsible or what someone else needed from you. The question hit Sarah like a physical blow. When indeed, her whole adult life had been a series of responsible choices, of putting others' needs above her own desires. Even this trip she'd scraped and saved for Ellie's sake, not her own. I'm not saying you should marry the guy, Ellie continued, rolling her eyes. That's obviously bananas, but coffee, a nice dinner, a brief fling with a handsome CEO while you're in a different city? What's the harm? What indeed? Sarah wondered. Except that fling had never been in her vocabulary, and James had made it clear he was looking for something more substantial. Still, Ellie had a point. What was the harm in exploring the connection, seeing if there was anything to his extraordinary claim that he wanted to marry her? Maybe, Sarah said, neither committing nor refusing. Let's focus on your wedding for now. That's why I'm here, after all. Ellie accepted the deflection gracefully, launching back into her flower crisis. But as they finished their coffees and headed to their parents' home, Sarah found her hand drifting to her purse where James's business card rested like a promise or a warning of possibilities she'd never considered. That night, in the familiar bedroom of her childhood, Sarah lay awake, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a city she barely knew. Her phone lay on the nightstand, James's contact information now entered into her contacts. Her finger had hovered over the call button several times before she'd set the phone aside. This is ridiculous, she told the darkened ceiling. He's a stranger, a man with serious health issues and unrealistic expectations who proposes to women he's just met. But another voice, quieter but more insistent, whispered, What if? What if there was something real in that brief connection? What if this was her one chance to step off the safe, predictable path she'd been following for decades? Sarah rolled over, punching her pillow into a more comfortable shape. Tomorrow would be filled with wedding preparations, family obligations, the comfortable routine of being the reliable older sister. But perhaps the day after. Perhaps then she might find the courage to send a text, to suggest that coffee. With that tentative plan forming in her mind, she finally drifted off to sleep, dreaming of blue eyes and impossible choices. The Mitchell family home was exactly as Sarah remembered, a modest two-story in Millbrae with faded blue siding and a garden her mother tended with religious devotion. Inside, chaos reigned. Wedding gifts were stacked in the living room, ribbons and tulle occupied every available surface, and the dining room had been transformed into command central, with Ellie's color-coded binders and seating charts dominating the table. Honey, you remember the Johnsons from church? They just called to say they're bringing their nephew after all, so we need to squeeze in another seat at table 7, Sarah's mother announced as she entered the kitchen, barely glancing up from her notepad. "Oh, Sarah, good morning. There's coffee in the pot. Did you sleep well?" "Fine, Mom, thanks." Sarah poured herself a mug of coffee, observing her mother's frantic energy with a mixture of amusement and concern. Catherine Mitchell had always been the orchestrator of family events, treating each one like a military campaign requiring strategic precision. "Ellie's upstairs with the seamstress for her final fitting. Your bridesmaid dress is hanging in the guest room closet. Try it on this morning to make sure it fits. The alterations lady can make adjustments before she leaves." Catherine finally paused, really looking at her older daughter. "You've lost weight since you sent your measurements." Sarah shrugged. "I've been busy at work." "Too busy to eat properly?" "You work too hard, Sarah." Catherine's expression softened with concern. "Always taking care of everyone but yourself." It was an old conversation, one they'd had in various forms since Sarah was a teenager, volunteering at the hospital while her classmates went to parties. Sarah took a sip of coffee instead of responding. "Anyway, after the fitting, we need to go to the florist to sort out this rose debacle, then stop by the bakery to finalize the cake details, and then—" "Mom," Sarah interrupted gently, "I've been traveling all day yesterday. Could I have a morning to just breathe before the wedding whirlwind?" Catherine looked momentarily taken aback, then chagrined. "Of course, honey. I forget sometimes that not everyone operates at my pace. You relax this morning. We'll handle the errands." "Thanks." Sarah squeezed her mother's hand, feeling a pang of guilt. Catherine meant well, and her frantic energy came from a place of love. "Though, if you could just look at the seating chart before we leave." Catherine pointed toward the dining room. "Make sure I haven't seated you next to anyone unbearable for the reception." Sarah smiled despite herself. "I'll check it." After her mother bustled off, Sarah settled at the kitchen table with her coffee, enjoying the rare moment of solitude. The house would soon be buzzing with bridesmaids, relatives, and the various professionals required to pull off Ellie's dream wedding. For now, though, she had peace. Her phone vibrated on the table, a text from Ellie upstairs. "Have you called Mr. CEO yet?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "No, and stop matchmaking. Focus on your wedding." 3 dancing dots appeared, then Ellie's reply, "Multitasking, call him, live a little." Sarah put her phone down without responding. Her sister's words from yesterday echoed in her mind. "When was the last time you did something unexpected?" She couldn't remember, and that realization bothered her more than she wanted to admit. She wandered into the dining room to check the seating chart as promised. Table 3, where the bridesmaids would sit. Sarah Mitchell seated beside Tyler Jenkins, Ellie's fiancé's college roommate. Sarah vaguely remembered Ellie mentioning him. 36, divorced, works in finance. Another transparent matchmaking attempt. She considered moving the place cards around but decided against it. It wasn't worth the inevitable questions from her mother. Back in the kitchen, Sarah refilled her coffee and stared out the window at her mother's immaculate garden. Spring flowers were in full bloom, a riot of colors against the green lawn. Her mind drifted back to James, to his unexpected proposal. Was it just the romantic gesture of a man facing his mortality, or something more? She'd Googled his company last night. Callaway Adaptive Technologies was indeed a leader in their field, with offices in Boston, San Francisco, and Tokyo. James Callaway was legitimate, at least professionally. Taking a deep breath, Sarah picked up her phone and composed a text. "Hi, James. It's Sarah Mitchell from the flight. I've been thinking about your offer for coffee. Would tomorrow morning work? Say 10 a.m.? Her thumb hovered over the send button for a full minute before she finally pressed it, her heart hammering ridiculously. She set the phone down, half hoping he wouldn't respond. The reply came almost immediately. "Sarah, I'm delighted to hear from you. Tomorrow at 10 would be perfect. There's a wonderful cafe near my hotel. Cafe Bella on Powell Street. Looking forward to it." It was happening. She had a date. No, not a date, just coffee. With the man who'd proposed to her on an airplane. Sarah's practical side warned her this was madness, but another part, a part that had been dormant for too long, felt a thrill of anticipation. Her contemplation was interrupted by a commotion upstairs, followed by Ellie's voice calling down, "Sarah! Mom! Come see! The dress is perfect!" Wedding preparations consumed the rest of the day and most of the evening. Sarah was swept up in fittings, flower arrangements, and family dynamics as relatives began arriving for the rehearsal dinner the following night. By the time she collapsed into bed, she was too exhausted to worry about her impending coffee with James. Morning arrived with a gentle fog that cloaked the city in mystery. Sarah stood before the guest room mirror, critically assessing her appearance. She'd packed mostly practical clothes for the wedding festivities, not anticipating any other social engagements. After trying 3 different outfits, she settled on a simple blue dress that Ellie had once told her brought out the color in her eyes. "Going somewhere special?" her father asked when she entered the kitchen, dressed more carefully than usual. "Just meeting a friend for coffee," Sarah replied, trying to sound casual. Robert Mitchell lowered his newspaper, eyebrows raised. "A friend? In San Francisco? I thought you didn't know anyone here." "Someone I met on the flight?" Sarah admitted, pouring herself a coffee. Her father studied her for a moment, then smiled. "Well, that's nice. Your mother and Ellie are already at the bridal salon for hair trials. They said not to expect them back until afternoon." Sarah nodded, relieved to avoid her sister's knowing looks and her mother's inevitable questions. "I should be back in plenty of time for the rehearsal dinner." "Take your time," her father said, returning to his paper. "It's good to see you doing something for yourself for a change." The ride into the city passed in a blur of anticipation and second thoughts. Sarah had opted for a rideshare rather than borrowing her parents' car, giving herself no easy escape if the coffee went poorly. As the car navigated the steep hills of San Francisco, she rehearsed potential conversations in her mind, preparing herself for anything from awkward small talk to another grand declaration. Café Bella was tucked between a bookshop and a vintage clothing store on Powell Street, its striped awning and outdoor seating giving it a distinctly European feel. Sarah arrived 10 minutes early, her nerves making her punctual to a fault. She chose a table near the window, ordered a cappuccino, and waited, fighting the urge to check her reflection in the mirror behind the counter. At precisely 10 o'clock, a sleek black car pulled up outside. The driver emerged and opened the back door, helping James into his wheelchair with practiced efficiency. Sarah's breath caught as she watched him through the window. He was as handsome as she remembered, dressed in a casual button-down shirt and dark jeans that somehow looked both relaxed and expensive. James spotted her through the window and smiled, a warm, genuine smile that made her stomach flip in a way she hadn't experienced since her college days. He navigated his wheelchair through the cafe entrance with ease, the other patrons instinctively making way without making it obvious they were doing so. "Sarah," he said as he reached her table, his voice as rich and compelling as she remembered. "You look lovely." "Thank you," she replied, suddenly shy. "Would you like a coffee or something else?" "Coffee would be perfect. Black, please." Sarah signaled the barista who came to take James's order. The momentary distraction gave her time to collect herself, to remember that this was just coffee with a near stranger, not the life-altering event it felt like. "I wasn't sure you'd contact me," James said once they were alone again. "I know my proposition on the plane was unexpected." "That's one word for it," Sarah agreed, finding her voice. "Most people would say bizarre or completely inappropriate." James smiled ruefully. "Fair enough. I've been told I can be too direct sometimes. A side effect of knowing your time might be limited. You stop wasting it on social niceties." "About that," Sarah said, leaning forward slightly. "You mentioned a degenerative condition. May I ask what it is? I'm a nurse, remember?" "Of course." James accepted his coffee from the barista with a nod of thanks. "It's a rare form of motor neuron disease, Similar to ALS, but with a slower progression. It started with my right side, as you noticed. Eventually, it will affect my left side as well, and then my respiratory system." Sarah nodded, her professional knowledge filling in the blanks of what he wasn't saying. Eventually, he would lose all motor function, becoming dependent on others for every basic need. And finally, when the disease reached his lungs— "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That's a difficult diagnosis to face." "It is," James agreed, "but it's also clarifying. It forces you to confront what you really want from the time you have left." He held her gaze steadily. "Which brings us back to my unusual proposal." Sarah took a sip of her cappuccino, buying time. "James, I'm flattered, truly. But you must see how strange this is from my perspective. People don't just meet on airplanes and decide to get married." "Don't they? I'd argue that's exactly what people do. Perhaps not on airplanes specifically, but they meet, they feel a connection, and they make a decision to build a life together. The only difference here is the time frame." "A rather significant difference," Sarah pointed out. "Most people date for months or years before marriage. And I would happily date you for months or years, Sarah, if time were a luxury I possessed." James's expression was earnest, without a trace of self-pity. "But it's not. So I'm proposing something more accelerated." There was a logic to his argument that Sarah couldn't quite dismiss, despite its apparent absurdity. "Tell me more about yourself," she said instead of addressing his point directly. "Beyond what you shared on the plane. If you're asking me to consider something as life-changing as marriage, I should at least know the basics. Favorite color? Political views? Stance on pineapple on pizza?" James laughed, a sound that transformed his face and made him appear younger, more carefree. "Blue, moderate with progressive leanings on social issues, and absolutely not. Fruit doesn't belong on pizza." "Wrong answer on the pizza," Sarah teased, surprised at her own playfulness. "But I'll overlook it for now." "Generous of you." James's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled. "What else would you like to know?" They spent the next hour exchanging the kind of information that usually unfolds over multiple dates: family backgrounds, education, career paths, likes and dislikes. James had been an only child, raised by his grandmother after his parents died in a car accident when he was 8. He'd joined the army after college, served as a combat medic, and was injured during his 3rd deployment to Afghanistan. After returning home, he'd used his military medical training and engineering background to develop technologies for other disabled veterans, eventually building Callaway Adaptive Technologies into an industry leader. Sarah shared her own story, growing up in the Bay Area with Ellie, studying nursing at Boston University, and choosing to stay on the East Coast for her career while her family remained in California. She told him about Meadowbrook Nursing Home, about the residents she'd come to care for as family, and about the satisfaction she found in easing their final years. "You have a gift for caring," James observed. "It's evident in how you speak about your patients." "They're not just patients to me," Sarah said, "especially the ones without family who visit. Sometimes I'm the only person who knows their stories, their fears, their small daily victories. That's beautiful, Sarah, and rare." James reached across the table, hesitating before gently touching her hand. "It's one of the qualities that drew me to you on the plane. You have a capacity for empathy that most people lack." Sarah looked down at his hand on hers, tan against her pale skin. His touch was warm, the connection sending a current of awareness up her arm. When she raised her eyes to his, the intensity of his gaze made her breath catch. "This is insane," she whispered. "We've known each other for less than 48 hours. "Sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind cannot yet comprehend," James replied softly. It sounded like a line from a movie, something Sarah would ordinarily have rolled her eyes at. But in this moment, in this charming cafe in a city that already felt like a dream, she couldn't summon her usual skepticism. The barista approached with fresh coffee, breaking the moment. Sarah withdrew her hand, suddenly aware that they'd been talking for nearly 2 hours. The cafe had filled around them, the lunch crowd beginning to arrive. "I should get back," she said reluctantly. "My sister's wedding rehearsal is tonight and there's still so much to do." "Of course." James nodded, understanding. "When is the wedding itself?" "Saturday afternoon." "And you return to Boston on Sunday?" Sarah nodded, a curious heaviness settling in her chest at the thought of leaving. "My flight is at 2 p.m. James seemed to be calculating something. "Would you have dinner with me tomorrow night? After your rehearsal dinner but before the wedding? I know it's a busy time for your family, but—" "Yes," Sarah said before she could overthink it. "I'd like that." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Wonderful. I'll make reservations somewhere special. What time works for you?" They settled on 8 p.m., James promising to send a car to pick her up from her parents' house. As they prepared to leave, an awkward moment ensued. What was the appropriate farewell for their unusual situation? A handshake seemed too formal, a kiss too forward. James solved the dilemma by taking her hand and bringing it briefly to his lips, an old-fashioned gesture that somehow suited him perfectly. "Until tomorrow, Sarah." Outside, his driver was waiting. Sarah watched as James maneuvered himself into the car with practiced movements, then gave her a final wave as the vehicle pulled away from the curb. She stood there for a moment, the San Francisco breeze playing with her hair, feeling as though she'd just stepped out of a dream into a different reality, one where accomplished, attractive men proposed on airplanes and kissed her hand after coffee. Her phone vibrated in her purse. A text from Ellie. "How was coffee? Spill everything when you get home." Sarah smiled, typing a reply as she hailed a rideshare. "It was nice. We talked. Having dinner with him tomorrow night." Ellie's response was immediate. "What? Details now." But Sarah put her phone away without responding, wanting to keep this morning, this feeling, to herself for just a little longer. As her ride navigated the San Francisco hills toward her parents' home, she found herself wondering if perhaps, just this once, something completely unexpected might also be exactly right. The Mitchell house was a flurry of activity when Sarah returned. Bridesmaids had arrived, bringing with them garment bags, makeup cases, and the high-pitched excitement of women who hadn't seen each other since college. Sarah slipped in through the side door, hoping to reach the guest room unnoticed, but Ellie intercepted her in the hallway, pulling her into the empty kitchen. "Finally!" Ellie hissed, eyes bright with curiosity. "I've been waiting for hours. Tell me everything about coffee with Mr. CEO." "There's not much to tell," Sarah demurred, though her flushed cheeks betrayed her. "We talked. He's interesting. End of story." "End of story? You're having dinner with him tomorrow night." Ellie blocked the doorway, arms crossed. "In the middle of my wedding weekend, I might add, which means he must be pretty special." Sarah sighed. "I don't know what he is, Elle. He's different from anyone I've ever met. Direct, intense, but also genuine." She hesitated, unsure how to explain what she herself didn't fully understand. "I can't figure out if I'm being completely irrational or if there's really something here worth exploring." Ellie's expression softened. "I've never seen you like this. Uncertain, yes, but also alive. Your eyes are practically sparkling." "Don't be ridiculous," Sarah scoffed, but she couldn't help checking her reflection in the kitchen window. Did she look different? "So tell me more about him. What's he like? And what's with the wheelchair? Is he permanently disabled?" Sarah's nursing instincts kicked in, making her protective of James's privacy. "It's not my place to share his medical details, but yes, he uses a wheelchair due to a combat injury from his time as a military medic." "Wow, a war hero and a CEO." Ellie whistled softly. "And he's obviously into you." "It's not that simple." Sarah leaned against the counter, lowering her voice. "He has a progressive condition. It's going to get worse, not better. and he's been very upfront about that." "Oh." Ellie's excitement dimmed slightly. "That's tough. But it doesn't change how you feel about him, does it?" Did it? Sarah had been asking herself the same question since their coffee. As a nurse, she knew exactly what James's future held. The gradual loss of function, the increasing dependency, the eventual need for full-time care. It would be challenging for anyone, let alone someone he'd just met. "I don't know how I feel yet," she answered honestly. "But I'm having dinner with him tomorrow, so I guess that says something." Ellie squeezed her arm. "I think it's great, Sarah. Truly. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Don't overthink it. For once in your life, just feel." Before Sarah could respond, Catherine Mitchell bustled into the kitchen, clipboard in hand. "There you are. We need to leave for the church in 20 minutes for the rehearsal. Why aren't you dressed yet?" The rehearsal and dinner that followed were lovely, if somewhat overwhelming for Sarah. St. Catherine's Church, where the Mitchell family had attended services for decades, was decorated with early preparations for the wedding, ribbon markers on pews, floral arrangements being tested for placement, an arch at the altar awaiting its final touches. The wedding party practiced their procession, with Sarah walking alone as maid of honor. Tomorrow she would be paired with David's best man, his brother Michael. She found herself wondering what James would think of the ceremony, then chided herself for the thought. It wasn't as if she could invite a man she'd just met to her sister's wedding. At the rehearsal dinner, held at an upscale Italian restaurant in downtown San Francisco, Sarah was seated between her mother and Tyler Jenkins, the divorced friend of David's that her mother had not so subtly suggested might be perfect for her. Tyler was pleasant enough, reasonably attractive with a stable career and decent manners, but Sarah found herself comparing him unfavorably to James. Tyler's stories about his job in finance seemed shallow next to James's passion for adaptive technology. His practiced smile never reached his eyes the way James's did. He asked questions but didn't really listen to her answers, already formulating his next remark. "So, what do you do for fun in Boston?" Tyler asked, refilling her wine glass without asking if she wanted more. "I don't have much free time, honestly," Sarah replied. "When I'm not working, I volunteer at a community garden that supplies fresh produce to local food banks." "Ah, that's nice," Tyler said, clearly disinterested. "I'm big into sailing myself. Have a small boat docked at the marina. Perhaps I could take you out sometime when you visit San Francisco again?" Sarah murmured something non-committal, relieved when her mother tapped her glass, signaling the start of the toasts. As family members and friends stood to share stories and well wishes for Ellie and David, Sarah found her mind drifting to her upcoming dinner with James. What would they talk about? Would he mention his proposal again? And why did the prospect both terrify and exhilarate her? After the third glass of wine was pressed upon her by a well-meaning aunt, Sarah excused herself to get some air. The restaurant had a small balcony overlooking the bay, the Golden Gate Bridge visible in the distance, its lights twinkling against the night sky. She leaned against the railing, breathing in the salt-tinged air. "Hiding from the festivities?" Her father's voice came from behind her. Sarah turned with a smile. "Just needed a breather. It's a lot." Robert Mitchell joined her at the railing, his sturdy presence comforting as it had always been. A retired high school principal, he had the patient demeanor of someone accustomed to handling other people's chaos without becoming part of it. "Your mother means well," he said, correctly interpreting her need for escape. "She just wants you to be as happy as Ellie is." "I know," Sarah sighed. "But setting me up with Tyler? Really?" Her father chuckled. "He does talk an awful lot about his boat." They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching a ferry cross the bay, its lights reflecting on the dark water. "This friend you met for coffee," her father said eventually. "Is it serious?" Sarah turned to him, surprised. "Did Ellie tell you about that?" "No, your mother did. Ellie told her." Of course. Nothing stayed private in the Mitchell family for long. "I don't know if it's serious, Dad. We just met." Her father nodded thoughtfully. Sometimes that's all it takes. I knew I would marry your mother the day I met her. Walked right into her father's hardware store to buy a hammer, and there she was, arguing with a supplier about a shipment of nails. She was so passionate, so sure of herself. He smiled at the memory. I asked her to dinner that same day. We were engaged 6 weeks later. Sarah stared at him astonished. I never knew that. You always made it sound like you dated for ages before getting engaged. Your mother thought the real story sounded too impulsive, especially when you girls were teenagers. She didn't want you running off with the first boy who made your heart beat faster. He shrugged. But sometimes when it's right, you just know. The similarity to what James had said, sometimes the heart recognizes what the mind cannot yet comprehend, sent a shiver through Sarah that had nothing to do with the cool night air. He's very different from my usual type, she admitted. Successful, confident, and he uses a wheelchair. He was injured in Afghanistan. Her father's expression showed nothing but sincere interest. A veteran, that takes courage. Yes, it does. Sarah hesitated, then added, I'm having dinner with him tomorrow night. Good. Robert nodded approvingly. And if I hear anyone giving you a hard time about missing the post-wedding family brunch on Sunday morning, I'll run interference. Sarah laughed, linking her arm through his. Thanks, Dad. That's what fathers are for. He glanced at his watch. We should head back inside. Your mother's probably organizing a search party as we speak. Upon returning to the dining room, Sarah found that the formalities had given way to more relaxed mingling. Ellie caught her eye from across the room and mouthed, "Where were you?" with dramatic emphasis. Sarah just smiled and shook her head, reclaiming her seat beside Tyler, who immediately launched into a detailed description of his boat's specifications. As the evening wound down and the wedding party prepared to leave, Sarah received a text from James. I hope your rehearsal dinner went well. Looking forward to tomorrow. The car will pick you up at 8. Sleep well, Sarah. Such a simple message, yet it sent a flutter through her chest that made her feel like a teenager again. She replied with an equally simple, thank you. Looking forward to it too. Then tucked her phone away, aware that Ellie was watching her with knowing eyes. Back at the house, while the bridesmaids chatted and prepared for bed, Sarah slipped into the backyard with a cup of tea. The garden was peaceful at night, her mother's flowers giving off a sweet fragrance that mingled with the earthier scents of soil and grass. She settled on the old wooden swing her father had built when she and Ellie were children, pushing off gently with her foot. The events of the day swirled in her mind. Coffee with James, his gentle kiss on her hand, Ellie's encouragement, her father's surprising revelation about his own whirlwind romance. Was the universe trying to tell her something? Sarah had never been one for signs or cosmic messages, preferring logical analysis and careful planning. But now she found herself wondering if perhaps life's most important decisions couldn't be charted and measured like vital signs on a medical chart. Mind if I join you? Ellie appeared in the doorway, wrapped in a fluffy robe, her hair pulled up in a messy bun. It's your wedding weekend. You can do whatever you want, Sarah replied, making room on the swing. Ellie sat beside her, the swing creaking slightly under their combined weight. Remember how we used to sit out here after Mom and Dad were asleep, sharing secrets? You mean how you used to tell me about all the boys you were crushing on and I would remind you of the statistical improbability of marrying your high school sweetheart? Sarah smiled at the memory. And yet here I am marrying David, who sat behind me in 10th grade biology. Ellie bumped her shoulder playfully. Sometimes the heart doesn't care about statistics. They swung in silence for a moment, the rhythmic motion soothing. What if it's real? Sarah asked softly, finally voicing the thought that had been circling her mind all day. What if this thing with James isn't just insanity or a midlife crisis or whatever, but something meaningful? Ellie considered this seriously. Then you owe it to yourself to find out. even knowing the challenges ahead? His condition will progress, Ellie. He'll need more and more care. Eventually. Sarah couldn't finish the sentence. If it's real, that won't matter, Ellie said simply. Or rather, it will matter. It will be incredibly difficult and painful, but it won't change how you feel about him. Sarah thought about her patients at Meadowbrook, about the spouses who visited faithfully every day, who brought photos and favorite foods, who held wrinkled hands and reminisced about better days. That was love. Not the fairy tale version, but the real thing, tested by illness and age and still enduring. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Ellie replied, squeezing her hand. If it wasn't scary, it wouldn't be worth doing. When Sarah finally went to bed that night, her dreams were a jumble of wedding preparations and James's blue eyes, of hospital rooms and dance floors, of beginnings and endings intertwined in ways she couldn't separate. She woke early, before the rest of the house stirred, and stood at the guest room window watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of pink and gold. Today was Ellie's wedding day, a day of celebration, of family, of new beginnings, and tonight she would have dinner with a man who had proposed to her on an airplane, a man who made her question everything she thought she knew about love and timing and the careful plans she'd made for her life. Sarah had always been the sensible one, the planner, the one who made careful, rational decisions. But standing there in the quiet dawn, she made a different kind of decision. Tonight, she would listen to her heart instead of her head. She would give this unexpected connection a chance, whatever that might mean. With that resolution firmly in mind, she began to prepare for the day ahead, a day that would change her sister's life forever, and perhaps, in ways she couldn't yet imagine, her own as well. The day of Ellie's wedding dawned clear and bright, the early fog burning away to reveal a perfect California spring day. The Mitchell household erupted into organized chaos by 7 a.m. Bridesmaids in matching robes crowded the bathrooms, makeup artists and hairstylists commandeered the living room, and Catherine flitted from room to room with her ever-present clipboard, checking items off with military precision. Sarah slipped into her role as maid of honor with practiced efficiency, managing minor crises, a missing earring, a torn stockings, a bridesmaid's emotional breakdown over an ex-boyfriend's unexpected RSVP, while ensuring Ellie remained calm and happy. It was what she did best, anticipating needs, solving problems, taking care of others. "You're a lifesaver," Ellie said, as Sarah handed her a glass of water and 2 Tylenol for the headache she'd predicted would result from too much champagne at the morning mimosa toast. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "That's what big sisters are for," Sarah replied, adjusting the delicate pearl comb securing Ellie's intricate updo. "Besides, after tomorrow, you'll have David to hand you Tylenol and water." "It's not the same," Ellie said, squeezing Sarah's hand. "No one knows me like you do." The moment of sisterly affection was interrupted by Catherine announcing it was time to depart for the church. The bridal party piled into decorated SUVs, Sarah carefully arranging Ellie's train and veil to prevent wrinkles during the ride. St. Catherine's Church was transformed for the occasion, sunlight streaming through stained glass windows onto pews adorned with white roses and trailing greenery. Sarah stood at the back, watching as guests filled the church, noting distant relatives she hadn't seen in years, friends from college, colleagues from Ellie and David's respective workplaces. A strange melancholy washed over her as the music began and bridesmaids started their processional. Not jealousy, she was genuinely happy for her sister, but a sudden, acute awareness of the path not taken. All those years focused on her career, on caring for patients, on being the reliable daughter and sister. When had she last allowed herself to want something just for herself? As she began her own walk down the aisle, Sarah felt her phone vibrate in the small pocket hidden in the folds of her bridesmaid dress. A text, probably from her mother wondering where some wedding item was stored. She ignored it, focusing on keeping her pace steady, her smile natural. Only when she reached the altar and turned to face the back of the church did she allow herself a moment of distraction, slipping the phone out just enough to glance at the screen. It was from James. "Wishing you joy on your sister's special day. Looking forward to creating our own memories tonight." Such a simple message, yet it sent a flutter through her chest that had nothing to do with the emotion of the wedding. She tucked the phone away quickly, refocusing on the ceremony as the bridal march began and Ellie appeared on their father's arm, radiant in her lace gown. The ceremony was beautiful, traditional vows spoken with genuine emotion, a unity candle lit by the couple, a reading from Sarah that she managed to deliver without her voice shaking despite the lump in her throat. When David and Ellie were pronounced husband and wife, the church erupted in applause, and Sarah found herself wiping away tears she hadn't expected to shed. The reception was held at a vineyard in Napa, requiring a scenic hour-long drive that gave Sarah time to contemplate the evening ahead. She had packed a second outfit for her dinner with James, a deep emerald dress she'd bought on impulse last year and never found occasion to wear. Too dressy for work, too sophisticated for the casual outings that constituted her social life in Boston. But tonight felt like the right time to wear something special. As maid of honor, Sarah's duties continued through the reception, supervising the guest book, coordinating with the photographer, making sure Ellie ate something despite her excitement, and finally delivering a toast that had the perfect balance of humor and heartfelt emotion. By the time the cake was cut and the dancing well underway, it was nearly 7 p.m. "I need to slip out soon," Sarah told her mother, who was contentedly watching the festivities from a table near the dance floor. "I have that dinner, remember?" Catherine's expression was equal parts curiosity and concern. "With the man from the airplane? Sarah, are you sure about this? We don't know anything about him." "I know enough," Sarah replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "And I want to know more." Her mother studied her face for a moment, then nodded. "All right. Your father mentioned he's a veteran? That takes a special kind of courage." "Yes, it does." Sarah was relieved her father had shared that detail, but apparently nothing about James's medical condition. That felt private somehow, not something to be discussed over wedding champagne. Catherine reached up to touch Sarah's cheek. "You seem different since you arrived. More present. Less in your head." She smiled softly. "It looks good on you." "Thanks, Mom." Sarah kissed her mother's cheek. "I'll see you back at the house later. Tell Ellie I'm sorry I had to leave early." "Oh, she knows," Catherine said with a knowing smile. "She's been watching the clock since 6, practically pushing me to send you on your way." Sarah laughed, realizing she should have expected nothing less from her matchmaking sister. She slipped away to the bridal suite, changing quickly into the emerald dress and touching up her makeup. Her reflection surprised her. There was a glow to her cheeks, a brightness to her eyes that hadn't been there before. Anticipation, she told herself. Nothing more. James's car, a sleek black sedan with a professional driver, was waiting precisely at 8 p.m. at the side entrance of the vineyard, as arranged via text earlier that day. Sarah slipped inside, settling into the plush leather seat with a flutter of nerves that felt strangely adolescent. "Good evening, Ms. Mitchell," the driver said politely. "Mr. Calloway is waiting at the restaurant. The drive should take approximately 40 minutes. Sarah nodded, using the time to compose herself. Outside the window, the Napa Valley landscape rolled by, vineyards bathed in the golden light of sunset, mountains rising majestically in the distance. The scene matched her mood, expansive, full of possibility, touched with a beauty that made her heart ache in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant. The car eventually turned off the main road onto a private drive that wound up a hillside. At the top stood a restaurant unlike any Sarah had seen before, a modern structure of glass and stone that seemed to grow organically from the mountainside, offering panoramic views of the valley below. "Sarah," the driver announced, coming around to open her door. one of the most exclusive dining experiences in Napa Valley. Mr. Calloway is already inside. The hostess greeted Sarah by name, leading her through the elegant space to a private corner table overlooking the valley. James was waiting, his wheelchair positioned at an angle that allowed him to see both the spectacular view and the approach to the table. He was dressed in a tailored suit that highlighted his broad shoulders, his salt and pepper hair neatly styled, his blue eyes lighting up when he saw her. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm, "you look absolutely stunning." "Thank you." She felt a blush rising to her cheeks as she took the seat across from him. "This place is incredible. I thought you might appreciate the view." James gestured toward the panorama of vineyards and mountains, now bathed in the deep purples and oranges of sunset. "How was the wedding?" "Beautiful, perfect, emotional." Sarah smiled, thinking of Ellie's radiant face as she'd exchanged vows with David. "My little sister is married. It doesn't quite seem real yet. And you performed your maid of honor duties admirably, I'm sure. I managed not to trip down the aisle or lose the rings, so I'd count it as a success." Sarah unfolded her napkin, suddenly aware that she was having dinner with a man who had proposed to her 2 days earlier in one of the most exclusive restaurants she'd ever seen. "This is a lot." James tilted his head questioningly. "Too much? We could go somewhere else if you'd prefer something more casual." "No, it's not that, it's just—" She gestured vaguely, encompassing the restaurant, the view, the private car that had brought her here. "This isn't my world. Private drivers, exclusive restaurants, CEOs who propose on airplanes." James smiled, the expression softening his strong features. "It wasn't my world either, once upon a time. I grew up in a small town in Oregon, raised by a grandmother who worked as a school secretary. We lived paycheck to paycheck. The army was my ticket to college." He took a sip of water. "The trappings of success came much later, and while I appreciate what they afford me, especially as my mobility becomes more limited, they're not what define me." The sommelier approached, presenting a wine list that looked more like an ancient tome. James deferred to Sarah, a gesture she appreciated. "We're in wine country. You should choose," she said. "I'm more of a whatever's on special at the grocery store wine drinker, I'm afraid." James laughed, a rich sound that made several nearby diners glance their way with smiles. "Honesty, another quality I admire in you." He turned to the sommelier. "We'll start with the Schramsberg Blanc de Blancs. I think we have something to celebrate." After the sommelier departed, Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Celebrate? My sister's wedding? That certainly." James held her gaze. "And this. Us. Here. Now." There it was again, that direct approach that simultaneously unnerved and exhilarated her. No games, no hidden meanings to decipher. Just honest expression of interest and intent. "James, about what you said on the plane," Sarah began, then paused as the sommelier returned with the sparkling wine, going through the ritual of presentation and pouring. When they were alone again, James leaned forward slightly. "I stand by what I said, Sarah, but I also understand it was unexpected, perhaps even unwelcome. I don't expect an answer tonight. I simply want to know you better, to give you a chance to know me, to see if what I felt on that plane was real or just an aberration." "And what exactly did you feel?" Sarah asked, curiosity overcoming her caution. "Recognition," James answered without hesitation, "as if I'd found someone I didn't even know I was looking for. A sense of possibility that I haven't felt in years." He smiled ruefully. "I know how it sounds. If someone had told me a week ago that I'd proposed to a woman I'd just met on a plane, I'd have questioned their sanity." Sarah couldn't help but laugh. "Well, that makes two of us." The tension broken, they fell into easy conversation as the meal progressed, course after exquisite course of the chef's tasting menu, each more delicious than the last. James told her more about his company, about the innovations they were developing, particularly a neural interface system that could potentially help patients with conditions like his maintain independence longer. "That's what drives me now," he explained, his passion evident in the way his eyes lit up. "Creating technology that gives people dignity and autonomy even as their bodies fail them." "It's remarkable work," Sarah said sincerely. "At Meadowbrook, I see how much difference the right adaptive equipment makes in quality of life." "Exactly." James nodded. "It's not just about extending life, but making that life worth living." The conversation shifted to their respective childhoods, to books they'd loved, to places they'd visited, and places they still hoped to see. Sarah found herself sharing stories she hadn't thought about in years, about her first nursing rotation, about the patient who'd left her his collection of vintage jazz records because she was the only one who'd taken the time to listen to them with him. As dessert arrived, a delicate construction of chocolate and local berries, Sarah realized they'd been talking for nearly 3 hours. The restaurant had quieted, many of the tables now empty as the evening drew to a close. "I've monopolized your time during your family visit," James said, noting the late hour. "I hope you don't regret it." "Not at all," Sarah replied honestly. "This has been wonderful. For me as well." James reached across the table, his hand open in invitation. After only a moment's hesitation, Sarah placed her hand in his. "Sarah, I know my proposal was unexpected. Too soon, too sudden. But I want you to know that nothing about my interest in you has dimmed since that moment. If anything, it's only grown stronger." Sarah looked down at their joined hands, his tanned and strong despite his condition, hers pale and smaller but fitting perfectly within his. "I feel something too," she admitted softly. "I can't explain it. It doesn't make logical sense. But it's there. Then perhaps we could explore it further? I'll be in Boston next month for a medical conference. Could I see you then?" The prospect of continuing whatever this was beyond her stay in San Francisco both thrilled and terrified Sarah. It would mean acknowledging that this wasn't just a vacation flirtation, a brief escape from her normal life. It would mean letting James into her real world, with its routines and responsibilities and carefully maintained boundaries. "I'd like that," she said finally, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. James's smile was like sunrise, slow, radiant, illuminating. "I was hoping you'd say that." He squeezed her hand gently. "And now, as much as I hate to end this evening, I should get you back to your family. You have a wedding brunch to attend tomorrow, I believe." Sarah groaned theatrically. "Don't remind me. My great-aunt Mildred will corner me for at least an hour to ask why I'm not married yet." "And what will you tell her?" James asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Sarah held his gaze, feeling a boldness she rarely allowed herself. "I'll tell her I'm exploring my options," she said with a small smile. "And that the right timing isn't always what we expect it to be." The drive back from Sarah to her parents' home was quiet, the darkness of the Napa Valley night broken only by occasional lights from distant houses and the soft glow of the car's dashboard. Sarah watched the shadows of vineyards pass by, feeling as though she'd stepped into someone else's life, someone more adventurous, more open to possibility than the practical nurse from Boston who carefully planned every aspect of her existence. James had kissed her hand again as they parted, his lips lingering slightly longer than they had after their coffee date. "Until Boston," he'd said, his blue eyes holding a promise that made her breath catch. "Until Boston," she'd echoed, already calculating the weeks until his conference. Now, as the car wound its way back toward Millbrae, Sarah tried to make sense of what was happening. In the span of 3 days, she'd met a man who had proposed to her, been adamantly against the idea, slowly warmed to him over coffee, and now found herself eagerly anticipating his visit to Boston. It was so unlike her normally measured approach to relationships, the few she'd had, that she hardly recognized herself. The house was quiet when she arrived, though lights still glowed in the kitchen. Sarah thanked the driver and made her way inside, finding her father at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the crossword puzzle. "There's my girl," Robert said, looking up with a smile. "How was your evening?" "It was—" Sarah searched for the right word. "Illuminating." Her father chuckled. "That's an interesting choice of adjective for a date." "It wasn't exactly a date," Sarah protested, though even to her own ears the denial sounded weak. Robert returned to his crossword. "Well, whatever it was, it seems to agree with you. You're practically glowing." Sarah busied herself making tea to hide her flush. "How was the rest of the reception?" "Lovely. Your sister and David left around 10. Everyone else trickled out shortly after." He filled in another clue. "Your mother went to bed about 30 minutes ago. Said to tell you the post-wedding brunch starts at 11 tomorrow. But knowing the level of champagne consumption tonight, she suspects it may become more of a lunch." Sarah smiled, settling across from him with her tea. "Probably wise." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the familiar ritual of late-night tea and crosswords a touchstone in the midst of all the changes and emotions of the weekend. "Dad?" Sarah finally ventured. "How did you know? With Mom, I mean. That it was right? Even though it was so fast?" Robert set down his pen, giving the question the consideration it deserved. "It wasn't any one thing. It was a feeling of recognition, I suppose, as if I'd found a piece of myself I hadn't known was missing." He smiled at the memory. "And there was a certainty, not about what would happen or how things would work out, but about her, about us together facing whatever came." "That sounds terrifying," Sarah admitted. "Oh, it was," her father agreed with a laugh. "Absolutely terrifying, but also the most natural decision I ever made." He studied her face. "Does that help at all?" Sarah nodded slowly. "Actually, yes, it does." "Good." Robert returned to his crossword. 7 letters? Sudden insight or understanding? "Epiphany," Sarah answered automatically. "Ah, perfect." Her father filled in the squares, then glanced up with a knowing smile. "Quite fitting, wouldn't you say?" Sarah rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress her smile. "Good night, Dad." "Good night, sweetheart. Sleep well." But sleep proved elusive. In the quiet of the guest room, Sarah replayed the evening in her mind. James's smile, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he laughed, the warmth of his hand holding hers. She thought about his condition, the progressive nature of his disease, the challenges that lay ahead for him. As a nurse, she knew exactly what those challenges would entail. The practical part of her brain, the part that had always steered her life, warned that this was madness, a recipe for heartbreak. Yet another voice whispered that perhaps the greatest madness would be walking away from something that felt so unexpectedly right, so surprisingly essential, even after such a short time. Sarah finally drifted off, her dreams a kaleidoscope of wedding flowers and panoramic views, of Ellie's smile and James's eyes, of beginnings and endings and the precious, uncertain time between. Morning brought chaos once again. Family members preparing for the post-wedding brunch, phone calls from relatives who'd already departed checking if items had been left behind, Catherine orchestrating it all with the precision of a symphony conductor despite her wedding day hangover. Sarah helped where she could, setting up the backyard for the casual buffet that would mark the official end of the wedding festivities. As she arranged flowers on the patio tables, her phone vibrated with a text. "I can't stop thinking about last night," James had written. "Thank you for a perfect evening." Sarah smiled, typing back. "It was wonderful, though I'm paying for our late night with wedding brunch setup duty." His response came immediately. "The price of sisterly devotion. What time is your flight tomorrow?" 2 p.m., heading straight to the airport from here." 3 dancing dots appeared as he composed his reply. "Dinner in Boston, April 15th? I arrived that afternoon for the conference." Sarah felt a flutter of anticipation as she responded, "It's a date." The brunch passed in a blur of congratulations, goodbyes, and promises to stay in touch with relatives rarely seen. Sarah played her part as supportive sister and helpful daughter, but part of her mind remained fixed on that date in April, now marked in her calendar with both excitement and apprehension. Ellie, radiant in her post-wedding glow, cornered Sarah near the mimosa station. "So, how was the date? You came in after I was asleep and I haven't had a moment to ask with all this." She gestured around at the brunch festivities. "It was nice," Sarah said, deliberately understated. "He's coming to Boston next month for a conference. We're having dinner." Ellie squealed softly, attracting looks from nearby aunts. "I knew it. You're smitten with CEO wheelchair guy." "His name is James," Sarah corrected. "And smitten is a bit strong. I'm intrigued." "Intrigued enough to see him again?" Ellie pointed out triumphantly. "That's huge for you, Sarah. When was the last time you had a second date with anyone?" Sarah couldn't remember, which was telling in itself. Her romantic history was a sparse collection of first dates that hadn't warranted seconds, brief connections that fizzled before they truly began. "This is different," she admitted. "He's different." "Tell me everything," Ellie demanded, linking their arms and steering them toward a quiet corner of the garden. Sarah found herself sharing details of the evening, the restaurant with its breathtaking views, the easy flow of conversation, the way James spoke about his condition matter-of-factly, but without self-pity. "He's building technology to help people like him maintain independence longer," she explained. "You can hear the passion in his voice when he talks about it." "Sounds like you can hear more than passion," Ellie teased gently. "You light up when you talk about him, you know." "I do not," Sarah protested automatically. "You absolutely do. It's nice to see." Ellie squeezed her arm. "You've spent so long taking care of everyone else. Maybe it's time someone took care of you for a change." "I don't need taking care of," Sarah objected. "Everyone does sometimes," Ellie replied. "Even super competent big sisters who think they're entirely self-sufficient." Before Sarah could formulate a response, their mother called for everyone's attention, announcing it was time for Ellie and David to open their wedding gifts. The moment of sisterly confidences ended as they rejoined the larger group, but Ellie's words lingered in Sarah's mind. Had she become so accustomed to being the caretaker that she'd forgotten how to accept care in return? The thought was uncomfortable, challenging her self-image as the capable, independent one who didn't need the emotional entanglements that others seemed to crave. The rest of the day passed in a flurry of activity, helping clean up after the brunch, assisting Ellie and David in organizing their gifts, packing her own belongings for tomorrow's return flight. By evening, the house had quieted. The extended family dispersed to hotels or flights home, leaving only the immediate family plus the newlyweds for a quiet dinner of wedding leftovers. "I can't believe it's over," Ellie said with a touch of melancholy as they sat around the kitchen table. "We planned for so long and now it's just done." "Not done," David corrected, taking her hand. "Just beginning." The simple statement hit Sarah unexpectedly hard. Just beginning. Wasn't that what she was facing as well? The beginning of something she couldn't quite define, with a man who had entered her life like a whirlwind, challenging everything she thought she knew about love and timing and her own capacity for emotional risk. Later, after everyone had retired to their rooms, Sarah stood at the guest room window, looking out at her mother's garden silvered by moonlight. Her packed suitcase sat ready by the door, her ticket and ID laid out for the morning. Everything in its place, organized and prepared as always. Yet inside, she felt anything but organized. Her thoughts and emotions refused to be neatly compartmentalized, spilling over into each other in ways that both frightened and exhilarated her. Her phone chimed softly. A final text from James. "Safe travels tomorrow. I'm counting the days until April." "So am I," she replied, surprising herself with the admission. "Good night, James." She set the phone aside and slipped into bed, staring up at the ceiling fan slowly turning in the darkness. Tomorrow she would return to Boston, to her apartment, to Meadowbrook and her patients, back to her real life. But for the first time in years, perhaps ever, that life felt like it might be on the verge of transformation. No longer a series of duties and routines, but a landscape of possibilities she was only beginning to explore. The flight back to Boston was smoother than the journey out, though Sarah found herself glancing at seat 14A more than once, half expecting to see James there with his penetrating blue eyes and unexpected proposals. Instead, she sat beside an elderly woman who slept most of the way and a college student engrossed in textbooks. As the plane began its descent into Boston, Sarah looked down at the familiar geography of her adopted city. The winding Charles River, the distinct neighborhoods, the historic buildings among modern skyscrapers. It looked exactly the same as when she'd left, yet somehow different, as if her changed perspective had altered the landscape itself. The Uber ride from Logan to her apartment in Somerville was quick, the driver mercifully silent as Sarah processed her return. Her building looked smaller somehow, the third-floor walk-up more tedious than she remembered as she lugged her suitcase up the stairs. Inside, everything was as she'd left it, neat, orderly, functional. The small plant on her windowsill had survived thanks to the timed watering system she'd set up. Mail was stacked neatly on the table where her neighbor, Mrs. Abernathy, had left it. The apartment was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Sarah unpacked methodically, placing dirty clothes in the hamper, hanging up the green dress that now carried memories of an extraordinary dinner. As she moved through her familiar routines, she felt a curious sense of displacement, as if she were performing actions from a life that no longer quite fit. When everything was put away, she made herself a cup of tea and sat at her small kitchen table, opening her laptop to check her work email. Meadowbrook would expect her back tomorrow, and there would be updates on her patients, schedules to review, medication changes to note. But before she could lose herself in work, a new email notification appeared, from James Calloway, sent just minutes ago, with the subject line, "Until April." Sarah clicked it open, her heart beating a little faster than she'd care to admit. "Sarah," it began, "I hope your flight was uneventful and you've arrived safely home. I wanted to thank you again for the time you shared with me in San Francisco. Our dinner conversation has stayed with me, particularly your insights about patient dignity and autonomy, concepts I thought I understood until seeing them through your compassionate perspective. I've confirmed my schedule for the Boston conference, details attached, arriving April 15th as mentioned. I'll be in town for 4 days and would love to see you as much as your schedule permits, though I understand your work responsibilities come first. Since our time will be limited, perhaps you might suggest some of your favorite places in Boston? I've visited many times for business, but never had a local guide to show me the city beyond conference rooms and hotels. Until April, I remain eagerly anticipating our next meeting. Yours, James, yours." Such a simple word, yet it carried implications that both thrilled and terrified her. Sarah read the email twice more, noting the formal yet warm tone, the respectful acknowledgement of her work, the clear interest in seeing her again without demanding or presuming. She began composing a reply, then stopped, realizing she was overthinking it, weighing each word, analyzing potential implications. This wasn't a medical chart requiring clinical precision. It was a correspondence with a man she was coming to care for, perhaps deeply. Starting over, she wrote from the heart rather than the head. "James, I arrived safely, though the flight lacked the interesting seatmate of my journey west. Boston seems both familiar and strangely new after my time away, or perhaps it's me who's changed. I'd be happy to show you some of my favorite places when you visit. The Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum is beautiful in April when the courtyard garden begins to bloom. The Freedom Trail offers both history and exercise if you're so inclined. And I know several restaurants that, while lacking the panoramic views of Sarah, offer food that I think you'd enjoy. I look forward to seeing Boston through new eyes with you. Until April, Sarah." She sent it before she could second-guess herself, then sat back with her tea, a small smile playing at her lips. 3 weeks. 3 weeks until she would see him again, until she could determine if what they'd begun in San Francisco was real or merely a vacation anomaly, a temporary escape from her usual practical self. For now, though, she had patience to care for, a life to resume. With renewed energy, Sarah turned to her work emails, preparing for tomorrow's return to Meadowbrook. Whatever possibilities lay ahead with James, her patience needed her now, and that solid ground of purpose and care was something she could stand on while navigating the uncharted territory of her heart. Meadowbrook Nursing Home welcomed Sarah back with the particular blend of chaos and routine that defined healthcare facilities everywhere. Mrs. Abernathy had taken a fall, but thankfully broken nothing. Mr. Geller's dementia had worsened, requiring a medication adjustment. The new resident in room 217 was refusing meals from anyone but the weekend nurse, Clayton. Sarah slipped back into her role with practiced ease, checking charts, administering medications, changing dressings, and offering the small dignities that made Meadowbrook more than just a place where the elderly waited out their final years. She held trembling hands, listened to stories about grandchildren, celebrated small victories like a few steps taken unassisted or an appetite returned after weeks of disinterest in food. Yet something had shifted. She moved through her duties with the same competence as always, but her mind occasionally drifted to San Francisco, to James, to possibilities she'd never before considered. When Mr. Peterson rambled about the love of his life, deceased for 15 years but still vividly present in his memory, Sarah found herself wondering about the nature of connection, how some bonds formed slowly over decades while others sparked into existence with unexpected immediacy. "You seem different, dear," observed Gladys Williams, one of her favorite residents, as Sarah helped her arrange family photos on her bedside table. "There's a lightness about you." "I was at my sister's wedding last weekend," Sarah explained, straightening a frame containing a faded photograph of Gladys with her late husband. "It was lovely." Weddings are nice," Gladys acknowledged, her arthritic fingers tracing the outline of her husband's face in the photograph. "But that's not it. You've got that look." "What look?" Sarah asked, genuinely curious. "The one I had when I met Harold. Like you've glimpsed something precious and unexpected, and you're not quite sure if it's really yours to keep." Gladys smiled, the deep wrinkles of her face arranging themselves into a map of a life well lived. "Did you meet someone?" Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "I did. On the flight to California, actually." "Ah, a travel romance. Those are the best kind. Your guard is down when you're away from home, you see. More open to possibility." Gladys patted Sarah's hand. "Tell me about him." So Sarah did, surprised at how easily the words flowed. She told Gladys about James's proposal on the plane, about coffee and dinner, about his condition and his work developing technologies for people with disabilities. She described the connection she'd felt, the sense of recognition her father had mentioned, and her own conflicted feelings about pursuing something with a man whose health would inevitably decline. Gladys listened with the attentiveness of someone who had lived long enough to recognize what mattered. When Sarah finished, the older woman nodded thoughtfully. "Love is always a risk, dear. Always. Even when you're young and healthy and think you have all the time in the world." She gestured to the photograph of Harold. "We had 47 years together. Good years, mostly. Hard ones, too, especially at the end when the cancer took hold. But if I'd known on our wedding day exactly how it would end, the pain, the hospital rooms, the goodbye, I'd still have said yes in a heartbeat." "That's beautiful, Gladys," Sarah said softly. "It's just truth. The only real tragedy is refusing love because you're afraid of the pain that might come with it." Gladys straightened a doily on her table with precise movements. "Now, tell me more about this technology he's developing. My grandson is studying biomedical engineering, you know." The conversation with Gladys stayed with Sarah throughout the week, weaving through her thoughts as she moved through her shifts, her errands, her quiet evenings alone in her apartment. She and James had established a pattern of communication, emails every few days, occasional texts, once a brief phone call when he was between meetings and she was on her lunch break. Their exchanges were thoughtful, often centered around their respective work, but venturing into personal territory as well. Childhood memories, favorite books, the small details that formed the architecture of their separate lives. 3 days before his planned arrival in Boston, James sent a more personal email than usual. "Sarah, I had a difficult medical appointment today. My neurologist confirmed what I've suspected. The progression is happening more quickly than initially projected. Nothing dramatic, but a reminder that the timeline we thought we had might be somewhat compressed. I debated whether to share this with you now or wait until we meet in person. I chose now because I want you to have time to process it, to consider what it might mean for any potential relationship between us. I would completely understand if this changes your perspective on seeing me when I'm in Boston. Some specifics, since I know your medical mind will want them. There's increased weakness in my left hand, which was previously unaffected. My walking tolerance with braces is down from 20 minutes to about 5-7 minutes before fatigue becomes significant. My respiratory function remains good, but there are some concerning indicators in the latest tests. The prognosis adjustment isn't drastic, perhaps 4 good years rather than 5, but I believe in transparency. You deserve all the information to make choices that are right for you. Whatever you decide about our time in Boston, please know that meeting you has enriched my life in ways I hadn't thought possible anymore. Yours, James." Sarah read the email twice, her nurse's mind automatically translating his clinical details into their practical implications. Increased weakness in his previously unaffected hand meant accelerated loss of independence. Decreased walking tolerance meant greater reliance on the wheelchair. The respiratory concerns were perhaps most significant, the beginning of the path toward eventual respiratory failure, the most common cause of death in conditions like his. Her first instinct was professional, to research the latest treatments, to suggest specialists, to outline management strategies. But she forced herself to set that aside and examine her emotional response. Was this new information changing her feelings about seeing him? About exploring whatever connection had begun on that flight to San Francisco? After careful reflection, she realized it didn't. If anything, his honesty and directness, sharing difficult information rather than concealing it to maintain her interest, only increased her respect for him. Her reply was equally forthright. "James, thank you for your honesty. As a nurse, I appreciate the specific details, though I'm sorry to hear about the accelerated progression. I imagine that was difficult news to receive, and I'm honored that you chose to share it with me. Your transparency doesn't change my desire to see you in Boston. I understand the implications of your condition, both now and down the road. I've spent my career caring for people through their final chapters, and while that's obviously a different relationship than what might develop between us, it means I'm not afraid of the challenges that come with progressive conditions. What matters to me isn't how many years might be projected, but the quality of connection possible in whatever time there is. I look forward to continuing our conversation in person. Take care of yourself and have a safe flight to Boston, Sarah." She hesitated briefly before adding a final line. "P.S. One of my elderly residents at Meadowbrook, a woman who was married for 47 years, recently told me, 'The only real tragedy is refusing love because you're afraid of the pain that might come with it.' I think she might be right." After sending the email, Sarah felt a curious combination of vulnerability and strength. She had acknowledged the reality of James's condition while opening herself to the possibility of pain, a different approach than her usual careful insulation from emotional risk. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Sarah deep cleaned her apartment, though she wasn't sure if James would ever see it. She rearranged her schedule at Meadowbrook, requesting the evening of his arrival and the following day off. She researched restaurants with good wheelchair accessibility, mentally plotting routes that would showcase her favorite parts of Boston without requiring too much exertion on his part. The morning of April 15th dawned clear and cool, a perfect spring day in Boston. The cherry trees along the Charles River were beginning to bloom, pink petals occasionally drifting on the breeze. Sarah woke early, too restless to sleep, and went for a run along the river, her mind racing with anticipation and lingering doubts. Was she being foolish? Impractical? Was she setting herself up for inevitable heartbreak? Or worse, was she allowing herself to be swept up in romantic notions that would fade once real life reasserted itself? As her feet pounded against the riverside path, Sarah recognized these questions as the familiar voice of her cautious self, the part of her that had always chosen safety over risk, predictability over possibility. That voice had served her well in many ways, keeping her professionally successful and emotionally protected. But it had also kept her isolated, watching life from a careful distance rather than fully immersing herself in its messiness and wonder. By the time she returned to her apartment, slightly breathless and glowing with exertion, Sarah had come to a decision. She would meet James tonight with an open heart and mind, ready to explore their connection without predetermined expectations or artificial barriers. She would be present, attentive, honest, and she would allow herself to feel whatever came without judgment or restraint. This resolution brought a sense of peace that carried her through her morning preparations and the countdown of hours until his arrival. James's flight was scheduled to land at 2:17 p.m. He would check into his hotel, freshen up, and meet her for dinner at 7 p.m. at Mistral, an upscale French restaurant in the South End, known for its romantic atmosphere and excellent accessibility. At 5:30, Sarah began getting ready, taking more time than usual with her appearance. She chose a simple but elegant navy dress that complemented her eyes, applied makeup with a careful hand, and styled her hair in loose waves rather than her usual practical ponytail. The woman in the mirror looked both familiar and strange. Still Sarah Mitchell, responsible nurse and reliable sister, but with a sparkle in her eyes and a flush to her cheeks that spoke of anticipation, of possibility. Her phone chimed with a text from James. "Landed safely, looking forward to seeing you tonight." Such a simple message, yet it sent a flutter through her chest. "Looking forward to it too," she replied. "Safe travels from the airport." At 6:45, Sarah called a rideshare to take her to the restaurant, deciding against driving to avoid parking challenges in the busy South End. As the car navigated the familiar streets of Boston, she watched the city pass by. The historic brownstones, the bustling sidewalks, the blend of old and new that gave Boston its unique character. It was her home, had been for nearly a decade, yet tonight it felt fresh, as if she were seeing it through new eyes, through James's eyes, perhaps. Mistral's elegant facade came into view, its understated sign and warm lighting promising a refined dining experience. Sarah arrived first, as planned, and was escorted to a corner table selected for both its romantic atmosphere and easy accessibility. She settled into her chair, smoothing her dress nervously, and ordered a glass of wine to calm her fluttering nerves. At precisely 7 the hostess approached again, this time escorting James to the table. He navigated his wheelchair with confident movements, his eyes finding Sarah immediately, his face lighting up with a smile that made her breath catch. He was dressed in a charcoal suit similar to the one he'd worn on the plane, but with a deep blue tie that complemented her dress as if they'd coordinated. "Sarah," he said as he reached the table, his voice warm and rich, just as she remembered. "You look absolutely beautiful." "Thank you," she replied, surprised at the steadiness of her voice despite the rapid beating of her heart. "You look quite handsome yourself." The hostess discreetly withdrew, leaving them alone in their corner of the restaurant. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, both perhaps marveling at the reality of being together again after weeks of anticipation. "I can't believe it's been 3 weeks," James said finally. "It feels both longer and shorter somehow." Sarah nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Like we just saw each other yesterday, but also like San Francisco happened in another lifetime. Precisely. James reached across the table, offering his hand palm up in invitation. After only a moment's hesitation, Sarah placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. I've thought about you every day, Sarah. About your smile, your insights, the way you really listen when people speak. I've thought about you too, she admitted softly. About your directness, your passion for your work, the way you face challenges without self-pity. Their hands remained joined as the waiter approached to take their drink orders. As James requested a sparkling water with lime, his blue eyes never leaving hers, Sarah felt a certainty settle over her like a warm cloak. Whatever happened next, tonight, tomorrow, in the uncertain future shaped by his condition, being here, with him, felt absolutely right. The tragedy, as Gladys had wisely observed, would not be in facing the pain that might come, but in missing the joy that was being offered right now, in this moment, across a restaurant table in Boston. Dinner at Mistral unfolded like a dream, the elegant surroundings, the exquisite food, and most importantly, the conversation that flowed as naturally as it had in California. They shared stories they hadn't covered in their emails, laughed over the coincidences and near misses that could have prevented them from meeting on that fateful flight, and gradually settled into a comfortable intimacy that felt both new and somehow familiar. "Tell me about your conference," Sarah said as they shared a chocolate souffle, the rich dessert melting on her tongue. "What will you be presenting?" "A new neural interface system we've been developing," James explained, his eyes lighting up with characteristic passion. "It allows people with limited motor function to control adaptive devices using minimal muscle movements, even just eye tracking in advanced cases." "That sounds incredible," Sarah said sincerely. "I've seen how frustrating it is for patients when they lose independence for tasks most people take for granted." "Exactly. It's not just about extending life, but making that life worth living. Having agency, dignity, the ability to communicate and engage with the world." James took a sip of his sparkling water. "Actually, I was hoping you might attend the presentation. It's on Thursday afternoon, open to healthcare professionals. Having someone with your perspective there would mean a lot to me." The invitation touched her. "I'd like that. I'd have to arrange coverage for my shift, but I'm sure it can be worked out." "Only if it's not disruptive to your work," James added quickly. "I know your patients depend on you." "They do, but they also benefit when I bring back new knowledge and perspectives." Sarah smiled. "Besides, I'm curious to see you in professional mode. I warn you, I get quite animated discussing adaptive technology. Some have called it dorky enthusiasm." "I find enthusiasm attractive," Sarah replied, surprised by her own boldness, "especially when it's directed toward helping others." The look James gave her in response made her cheeks warm. "You continue to surprise me, Sarah Mitchell," he said softly. After dinner, they decided to take advantage of the mild spring evening with a stroll along the nearby Commonwealth Avenue Mall, a tree-lined promenade lit by antique lamps that cast a gentle glow on the blooming flowers and historic brownstones. James navigated his wheelchair alongside Sarah, occasionally pointing out architectural details of the grand old buildings. "I've always loved Boston," he remarked. "The sense of history, of permanence. Cities like San Francisco and New York reinvent themselves constantly, but Boston knows exactly what it is." "I hadn't thought of it that way," Sarah said. "But you're right. It's one of the things that made me stay after nursing school. That sense of stability, of being grounded in something enduring." "Do you ever regret not going back to California, being closer to your family?" Sarah considered the question. "Sometimes, especially around holidays or important events like Ellie's wedding. But my life is here now, my work, my routines, my small circle of friends." She glanced at him. "What about you? You travel so much for work. Do you feel connected to any one place?" "Less than I'd like," James admitted. "My house in Cambridge feels more like a way station than a true home. That's something I've been reconsidering lately, especially as my condition progresses. The idea of home has started to matter more." There was something unspoken in his words, an implication that Sarah both understood and hesitated to acknowledge directly. Instead, she pointed out a blossoming cherry tree, its pale pink flowers luminous in the lamplight. They continued their leisurely pace, conversation shifting to childhood memories, professional challenges, books they'd both enjoyed. When they reached the public garden, Sarah noticed James subtly adjusting his position, a brief grimace crossing his face before he masked it. "You're in pain," she observed, her nurse's instincts kicking in. "We should head back." "It's manageable," he assured her, but she saw the fatigue in his eyes. "James," she said gently, "one thing you should know about me: I value honesty about physical limitations. Not just professionally, but personally. There's no judgment here, only concern." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "You're right. I'm pushing a bit tonight because I want our time to be perfect, but yes, I'm starting to feel it. The day of travel, the different chair that the airline provided." "Let's get you back to your hotel," Sarah said decisively. "We have tomorrow and the next day. No need to exhaust yourself on the first night." As they made their way back to Mistral, where James's driver waited, Sarah noticed how he kept the conversation flowing despite his obvious discomfort, a skill undoubtedly developed through years of managing his condition while maintaining professional and social engagements. It spoke to his strength of character, his determination not to be defined by physical limitations. At the restaurant entrance, James's driver helped him into the adapted vehicle, securing his wheelchair with practiced movements. "Will you join me for a nightcap at the hotel?" James asked Sarah. "The Four Seasons has an excellent lounge, quiet enough for conversation." Sarah hesitated. Going to his hotel felt like a significant step, laden with implications. As if reading her thoughts, James added, "Just a drink and conversation, Sarah. Nothing more than that? Not unless and until you're ready?" His directness was refreshing. "A nightcap sounds nice," she decided. The Four Seasons lounge was indeed perfect, elegant but understated, with comfortable seating arranged to afford privacy without isolation. They found a quiet corner where James could position his wheelchair comfortably and ordered drinks, a cognac for him, a chamomile tea for her. "Not a drinker?" he asked, noticing her choice. "Occasionally, but it's getting late, and I don't want anything clouding this evening." She wrapped her hands around the warm teacup. "I want to remember everything clearly." "As do I." James raised his glass in a small toast, to clarity, and to second meetings that surpass the first. They sipped their drinks in companionable silence for a moment, the soft piano music from the lounge creating a peaceful backdrop. "Sarah," James said finally, "there's something I've been wanting to ask you." Her heart quickened. "Yes? Would you consider showing me your workplace tomorrow?" "Meadowbrook. I'd like to see this place that means so much to you, to understand that part of your life better." It wasn't the question she'd been expecting, but it touched her deeply nonetheless. No one, not her previous boyfriends, not even Ellie or her parents during their visits, had ever explicitly asked to see where she worked, to understand that central part of her identity. "I'd like that," she said, surprised at the emotion welling up. "I'd have to check with administration, but visits from healthcare technology innovators are generally welcomed. Though I should warn you, long-term care facilities aren't glamorous places." "I'm not looking for glamour," James replied. "I want to see you in your element, doing the work that defines you." He set his glass down, his expression growing more serious. "Sarah, I know we've only had a handful of direct interactions, our flight, coffee, dinner in Napa, and now tonight. But our emails and calls have created a deeper connection than I've felt with anyone in years." Sarah nodded, unable to deny that she felt it too. That peculiar sense of recognition, of finding someone whose mind and heart seemed naturally aligned with her own, despite their different circumstances. "I'm not going to propose marriage again," James continued with a small smile, acknowledging the impulsiveness of his original approach. "But I am proposing something, that we consider this, us, as a relationship worth pursuing deliberately, despite the complications. Despite the geography, despite my health concerns, despite whatever reservations your very sensible mind might raise." He reached across the table, offering his hand. "What I'm asking is whether you're willing to explore this connection without predefined expectations or limitations, to see where it might lead if we allow it to unfold naturally." Sarah looked at his extended hand, at the man offering it, and felt the familiar battle between caution and desire, between protecting herself from potential pain and opening herself to genuine joy. She thought of Gladys's words about the real tragedy, being the refusal of love out of fear, of her sister's encouragement to do something unexpected, of her father's story about knowing immediately that her mother was the one. She placed her hand in his, feeling the warmth and strength of his grip. "Yes," she said simply, "I am." The next morning dawned bright and clear, a perfect spring day in Boston. Sarah had arranged for James to visit Meadowbrook at 11 a.m., giving her time to alert her supervisors and prepare her patients for a special visitor. She dressed with extra care, choosing professional attire that still flattered her figure, a concession to vanity she rarely made for work. James arrived precisely on time, dressed casually but elegantly in slacks and a blue button-down that enhanced his eyes. He brought a large arrangement of flowers for the nurses' station and specialized adaptive utensils designed by his company for residents with arthritis or limited grasp. "Thoughtful gifts," Sarah observed as she greeted him in the lobby, "though entirely unnecessary." "My grandmother raised me to never arrive empty-handed," James replied with a smile, "especially when being granted the privilege of seeing someone's professional domain." Sarah introduced him to her supervisor, explaining his work in adaptive technology. Dr. Patel, the medical director, immediately recognized Callaway Adaptive Technologies and engaged James in an enthusiastic discussion about potential collaborations. Sarah watched with quiet pride as James fielded questions with expertise and humility, never talking down to the staff despite his obvious brilliance in the field. The tour of Meadowbrook revealed a facility that was clean and well-maintained, if not luxurious. Sarah introduced James to several residents, including Gladys, who regarded him with keen interest. "So you're the airplane gentleman," Gladys said, her eyes twinkling. "Sarah told me about you, said you proposed after one conversation." "I did," James admitted, unfazed by her directness. "It was impulsive but sincere." Gladys studied him. "Most would call it foolish, but my herald proposed after 2 dances at the Veterans Hall in '52. Sometimes the heart knows what it wants." She patted his hand. "You take care of our Sarah now. She takes care of everyone else and forgets herself." "I've noticed that quality," James agreed, glancing at Sarah with a warmth that made her flush. After meeting several more residents, they visited the garden where Sarah had established a sensory area with fragrant herbs and flowers that residents with memory issues could enjoy through touch and smell. James watched as she knelt beside Mr. Peterson, guiding his gnarled hands to feel the soft leaves of lamb's ear and inhale the scent of lavender. "This is wonderful, Sarah," James said when they had a moment alone. "I can see why your residents adore you. You don't just provide care, you create meaningful experiences." His understanding of what she was trying to accomplish touched her deeply. Most people just see the medical side, medications, treatments, monitoring. But quality of life matters just as much, especially when quantity is limited. "I couldn't agree more," James said. "It's what drives my work too. Finding ways to maintain dignity and joy even as physical capacity diminishes." They shared a look of perfect understanding, a recognition of shared values that transcended their different professional approaches. In that moment, standing in the garden she'd created for her residence, Sarah felt something settle within her, a certainty that this connection with James was unlike anything she'd experienced before and worth whatever challenges might lie ahead. After leaving Meadowbrook, they enjoyed lunch at a cafe overlooking the Charles River, then spent the afternoon at the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum as Sarah had suggested in her email. The unique collection housed in a building designed to resemble a 15th-century Venetian palace provided the perfect backdrop for continuing their conversation, with frequent rests in the courtyard garden where spring flowers were beginning to bloom. "I have the conference tomorrow," James said as they watched a fountain bubbling amidst the greenery. "But I'm free in the evening. Would you join me for dinner again? I've made reservations at Menton." "Another fancy restaurant?" Sarah teased. "You're setting a high standard for dining experiences." "Is that a problem?" James asked, suddenly concerned. "We could go somewhere more casual if you'd prefer." Sarah touched his arm reassuringly. "I'm joking. Dinner sounds lovely." She hesitated, then added, "But maybe afterwards we could go to my apartment. Nothing presumptuous, just, I've seen your professional world today, and I'd like to show you my personal space, where I live, who I am outside of Meadowbrook." The smile that lit James's face was answer enough. "I'd like that very much, Sarah. Very much indeed." The Callaway Neural Interface Presentation Hall was filled to capacity, with healthcare professionals, engineers, and investors gathered to hear about the latest innovation from Callaway Adaptive Technologies. Sarah sat in the third row, dressed in professional attire, her nurse's ID badge from Meadowbrook visible on her lapel. She had arranged coverage for her shift, explaining to her supervisor that this technology might benefit their residents with progressive neuromuscular conditions. The stage was set with demonstration equipment, technical displays, and a sleek podium adapted for wheelchair accessibility. A buzz of anticipation filled the room as the conference moderator stepped forward to introduce the next speaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, our next presenter needs little introduction in the field of adaptive technology. James Callaway, CEO and founder of Callaway Adaptive Technologies, is here to unveil their latest neural interface system, a breakthrough in assistive devices for those with limited mobility. Please welcome Mr. Callaway." James wheeled onto the stage with confident grace, positioned himself at the podium, and smiled at the audience. He was dressed in a sharp charcoal suit with a burgundy tie, looking every inch the successful executive rather than the man who had walked with Sarah through the public garden last night, who had listened with genuine interest to Mr. Peterson's rambling stories at Meadowbrook. "Thank you," he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall. "I'm honored to be here today to share what our team has been developing over the past 18 months. A neural interface system we believe will fundamentally change how people with severe mobility limitations interact with their world." As James launched into his presentation, Sarah watched with growing admiration. He was a masterful speaker, articulate, engaging, with a perfect balance of technical detail and accessible explanation. He used humor effectively, particularly when sharing anecdotes about early prototypes and their failures. But the core of his message was deeply serious. Technology should serve human dignity and independence, particularly for those whose physical capabilities were compromised. The Callaway NIS-5 uses a combination of eye tracking, minimal muscle movement detection, and a revolutionary algorithm to interpret user intent, James explained, as a video demonstrated the system in use. On screen, a woman with advanced ALS was using slight movements of her cheek muscle and eye direction to control a computer, communicate through text-to-speech, and operate environmental controls in her home. "What sets our system apart is its adaptability," James continued. "As a user's condition progresses and they lose function in previously responsive muscle groups, the NIS-5 can be recalibrated to detect even more subtle movements, extending independence far longer than previous systems." Sarah found herself professionally impressed by the technology but personally moved by the passion driving it. This wasn't just business for James. It was clearly a mission, perhaps shaped by his own experience with progressive disability, but extending far beyond his personal circumstances to serve others facing similar challenges. The Q&A session that followed revealed James's depth of knowledge, not just about the technology itself, but about the lived experience of disability, the healthcare system's shortcomings, and the psychological impact of losing independence. He answered difficult questions with honesty and occasional humor, never overselling his company's solution or dismissing valid concerns. The NIS-5 isn't perfect, he acknowledged in response to one critical question. No technology is, but it represents a significant step forward, and we're committed to continuous improvement based on user feedback and advancing research. When the presentation concluded, James was immediately surrounded by attendees eager to speak with him. Sarah remained in her seat, content to watch from a distance as he navigated these professional interactions. His ease in this environment, confidently answering questions, connecting people with various team members stationed around the display area, graciously accepting both praise and criticism, spoke to years of leadership and public engagement. Eventually, the crowd around him thinned, and James glanced around the room until his eyes found Sarah. The smile that lit his face when he spotted her was personal, intimate, a clear delineation between James the CEO and James the man who had begun to care deeply for her. He made his way to her, navigating his wheelchair through the dispersing crowd. "You came," he said simply, as if her presence was a gift he hadn't dared to count on. "Of course I did," Sarah replied. "I wouldn't have missed it. It was fascinating, James. Truly impressive work." "Thank you." He glanced at his watch. "I have about an hour of obligations here, interviews with a couple of trade publications, a meeting with potential investors. Would you mind waiting? We could go for a late lunch afterwards." "I don't mind," Sarah assured him. "I'll explore the exhibition hall. Take your time." While James attended to his professional responsibilities, Sarah wandered through the conference exhibits, examining various medical technologies and innovations. Several pertained directly to her work at Meadowbrook, and she collected information to share with her colleagues. Occasionally, she glanced back to where James was engaged in interviews, impressed by his poise and articulation even after what must have been an exhausting presentation. Finally, he approached her, looking slightly tired but satisfied. "Freedom at last," he said with a smile. "Hungry?" They found a quiet cafe near the conference center, away from the crowds of healthcare professionals. Over sandwiches and salads, Sarah shared her impressions of his presentation and the questions it had raised for her about applications in long-term care settings. "The potential for residents with degenerative conditions is enormous," she said, "especially those who lose speech function but retain cognitive abilities. The isolation they experience is heartbreaking." "That's exactly the population we're hoping to serve," James agreed. "Though cost remains a barrier, insurance coverage for these systems is still inconsistent, and many people simply can't afford them out of pocket." "And your company? Is there any program for those who can't afford the technology?" James nodded. "We maintain a foundation that provides grants and subsidized systems for qualified applicants. It's not enough, it never could be, given the need, but we're committed to making the technology as accessible as possible." Sarah studied him across the table, struck again by the alignment of his professional mission with his personal values. "You're making a real difference, James, not just with the technology itself, but with how you're approaching its implementation." A slight flush colored his cheeks at her praise. "I'm trying. Sometimes it feels like a drop in the ocean compared to the need, but drops in the ocean matter," Sarah finished for him. "I see that every day at Meadowbrook. Small interventions that make one person's day better, one family's experience more dignified. It all matters." James reached across the table and took her hand. "That perspective, that's one of the things I find most remarkable about you, Sarah. You understand the value of individual dignity in a way many people in healthcare leadership positions never grasp. The afternoon passed quickly in conversation about their respective fields, the challenges they faced, and the satisfactions they found in their work. Sarah was struck again by how easily they communicated, how their professional backgrounds, though different, seemed to complement each other, creating a shared language and set of values that transcended their specific roles. As they left the cafe, James checked his watch. "I have one more commitment this afternoon, a panel discussion I've agreed to moderate. Would you like to join me for dinner afterwards? The reservation at Menton is for 8 hours." "I'd love to," Sarah said, "though I need to go home and change first." She hesitated, then added, "I could meet you at the restaurant, or you could come by my place first if you'd like, for that visit we discussed." "I'd like that very much," James replied, his blue eyes warm with anticipation. "Text me your address and I'll have my driver bring me around 7:30? "Perfect." She leaned down impulsively and kissed his cheek, the first such gesture she'd initiated. "I'll see you tonight." Back in her apartment, Sarah found herself scrutinizing her living space through new eyes. James's eyes. The one-bedroom walk-up was small but comfortable, decorated with care, if not luxury. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with medical texts, classic literature, and travel guides to places she'd someday hope to visit. Plants thrived on every windowsill, bringing life to the space. The furniture was mismatched but chosen for comfort rather than style. A plush armchair for reading, a sturdy table for meals and paperwork, a sofa deep enough to curl up on during rare evenings off. It wasn't impressive by the standards of someone who stayed at the Four Seasons and dined at Michelin-starred restaurants. But it was hers, authentically reflecting who she was and what she valued. She straightened a few items, put fresh flowers in a vase, but resisted the urge to make major changes. If James was going to be part of her life, he should see how she actually lived, not some artificially enhanced version. The most pressing concern was accessibility. Her third-floor apartment had no elevator, making it impossible for James to visit without assistance. The bathroom doorway was likely too narrow for his wheelchair, and the furniture arrangement would need adjustment for him to navigate comfortably. These were practical considerations that couldn't be addressed tonight, but they highlighted the adjustments that would be necessary if their relationship progressed. Sarah showered and changed into the green dress she'd worn for their dinner in Napa, remembering how James's eyes had lit up when he'd seen her in it. She was applying a final touch of lipstick when her phone chimed with a text. "Downstairs in 5 minutes." Her heart began to race with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. This felt significant, inviting James into her personal space, allowing him to see her life beyond the carefully managed interactions they'd had thus far. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that vulnerability was necessary for genuine connection. At exactly 7:30, her buzzer rang. "James?" she answered. "And driver," came the reply. "We could use some assistance with the logistics." "Of course. Coming down." In the lobby, she found James in his wheelchair with an athletic-looking man she recognized as his driver from previous evenings. The logistical challenge was immediately apparent: 3 flights of stairs with no elevator. "I'm so sorry," Sarah began. "I should have realized—" "It's not a problem," James assured her. "Michael and I have navigated worse obstacles. If you're comfortable with it, he'll help me up using a transfer device we brought. Then he'll bring up the chair separately." The process was efficient, if somewhat awkward. Michael used a specialized portable chair to carry James up the stairs, while Sarah led the way, holding doors and directing them. James maintained his dignity throughout, clearly accustomed to such adaptations, though Sarah noticed the momentary flash of frustration in his eyes, a reminder of the daily challenges his condition presented. Once inside her apartment, with James settled on her sofa and his wheelchair positioned nearby, Sarah found herself suddenly nervous. "It's not much," she said, gesturing around the space. "But it's home." James looked around with genuine interest. "It's lovely, Sarah. Very much you, practical but warm with touches of beauty." He nodded toward her plant collection. "You have a green thumb." "Plants are forgiving companions," she replied, relaxing slightly as she moved to sit beside him. "They don't mind my irregular hours or occasional neglect. Unlike humans," James observed with a slight smile, "we tend to be more demanding." Sarah met his eyes. "Some demands are worth accommodating." The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken meaning. Then James glanced at the bookshelves. "May I?" he asked, indicating his interest in examining her collection. "Of course." Sarah helped him transfer back to his wheelchair, then watched as he moved along the bookshelves, occasionally pulling out a volume that caught his interest. "Quite the range," he commented. "Medical texts, 19th century novels, poetry." He pulled out a worn copy of Pablo Neruda's love poems. "This one's been read often." Sarah blushed slightly. "A college indulgence. Beautiful language, though perhaps overly romantic notions." "Perhaps." James replaced the book carefully. "Or perhaps Neruda understood something about the heart that our more pragmatic minds resist." His gaze was steady, inviting her to acknowledge the growing depth of feeling between them. Sarah took a step closer, drawn by the intensity in his blue eyes. "James," she began, uncertain what she meant to say but feeling the need to speak. Her phone alarm chimed suddenly, breaking the moment. "Our reservation," she explained, silencing it quickly. "We should go if we're going to make it to Menton by 8. James nodded, though something in his expression suggested he would have been content to stay, to continue the conversation that had been building between them. "Another time," he said quietly. "We have that, at least." "Yes," Sarah agreed, gathering her purse and wrap. "We do." As they left her apartment, the reverse process of arrival, with Michael returning to help James navigate the stairs, Sarah found herself contemplating the physical barriers her home presented. If she and James continued to grow closer, practical considerations would need to be addressed. Her apartment would never be fully accessible. His home in Cambridge, presumably, was already adapted to his needs. These thoughts led to others, more challenging ones about the future, about the progression of his condition, about what a life together might look like, about the care he would eventually require and her capacity to provide it not just as a nurse, but as a partner. She pushed these concerns aside as they settled into the car, focusing instead on the present moment, on James beside her, handsome in his dinner jacket, on the evening ahead at one of Boston's finest restaurants, on the connection that continued to deepen between them despite the complications. "Penny for your thoughts?" James asked as the car pulled away from her building. Sarah turned to him with a smile. "Just thinking how unexpected life can be. A month ago I was flying to my sister's wedding, dreading the small talk with strangers. And now?" "And now?" James prompted when she trailed off. "And now I'm going to a restaurant I could never afford with a man who proposed to me on an airplane," she finished with a small laugh. "It's not exactly how I pictured my April unfolding." "Are you disappointed with this unexpected turn?" James asked, his tone light but his eyes serious. Sarah reached for his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Not in the slightest," she said softly. "Surprised, challenged, occasionally terrified, but not disappointed. Not at all." The relief and joy that spread across his face was answer enough to any lingering doubts. Whatever uncertainties lay ahead, whatever adjustments and challenges they might face, this connection was real and worth pursuing. The rest they would navigate together, one day at a time. 3 months after James's Boston visit, Sarah stood in the arrivals area of San Francisco International Airport, watching the flow of passengers emerging from the security checkpoint. Her heart quickened when she spotted him. His wheelchair navigated confidently through the crowd, his salt and pepper hair immediately recognizable even at a distance. When their eyes met across the terminal, His face lit up with a smile that still made her breath catch. "Welcome back to California," she said when he reached her, leaning down to kiss him softly. "It feels different this time," James replied, taking her hand. "Last time I was here for business. Now I'm here for far more important reasons." The past 3 months had transformed their lives in ways neither could have predicted during that first fateful flight. After James's Boston visit, they had established a rhythm of communication: daily video calls, text messages throughout their workdays, occasional care packages sent cross-country. James had returned to Boston twice more, and now it was Sarah's turn to visit him in his California home. "How was the flight?" she asked as they made their way toward baggage claim. "Comfortable enough, though I kept looking at seat 14C, wondering if any life-changing proposals were happening." His eyes twinkled with humor and memory. "Poor 14C," Sarah laughed, "forever burdened with unrealistic expectations." Outside, James's driver waited with an adapted vehicle. As they settled in for the drive to James's Palo Alto home, Sarah felt a flutter of anticipation. She had seen his house only through video call backgrounds, glimpses of spacious rooms with large windows, modern furnishings, and adaptive features seamlessly integrated into the design. Now she would experience it firsthand, another piece of James's life becoming real to her. The drive took them through the distinctive California landscape, so different from New England's dense greenery and historic architecture. James pointed out landmarks, sharing stories of his years building Callaway adaptive technologies in the heart of Silicon Valley. Sarah listened attentively, still learning the history that had shaped him before they met. James's home was a modern, single-story structure nestled among redwoods, its clean lines and large windows blending harmoniously with the natural surroundings. Inside, the space was open and airy, with wide doorways, smooth floors, and subtly integrated adaptive features that allowed James to navigate independently. Art adorned the walls, mostly abstract paintings in vivid colors with a few black and white photographs capturing natural landscapes. "It's beautiful," Sarah said honestly as James showed her around. "So much light. That was essential to me, bringing the outside in," James explained. "When mobility becomes limited, connection to nature becomes even more important." They moved through the house, James indicating the guest room where Sarah would stay, his home office with its array of technical equipment, the kitchen designed for accessibility, and finally a sunroom overlooking a Japanese-inspired garden. "This is my favorite space," James said, positioning his wheelchair near a large window. "Coffee in the morning, watching the birds, sometimes working with the doors open to catch the breeze." Sarah could picture him there perfectly, reading reports, developing ideas for his company, pausing occasionally to observe a hummingbird or contemplate the carefully arranged stones in the garden. It was a peaceful space that suited the contemplative side of his nature she'd come to know through their many conversations. "I can see why you love it," she said, settling into a cushioned chair beside him. "It feels restorative." "It is." James turned to face her, his expression growing more serious. "Sarah, there's something I want to discuss with you while you're here. Something important." Sarah felt a flutter of nervousness. "That sounds ominous." "Not at all," he assured her quickly. "Just significant. But it can wait until you've settled in, had some time to rest from your journey." "James," she reached for his hand, "you know I prefer directness. What is it?" He smiled at that, acknowledging her characteristic forthrightness. "Very well, I've been offered a remarkable opportunity, a partnership with Massachusetts General Hospital to establish an adaptive technology center. It would mean relocating CAT's primary research facility to Boston, with a satellite office remaining here in California." Sarah's heart skipped. "You would move to Boston?" "I'm considering it, yes. The opportunity is exceptional from a business standpoint. access to world-class medical researchers, a significant endowment to expand our work, clinical trial possibilities. He paused, his blue eyes holding hers steadily. But I won't pretend my personal considerations aren't equally significant. The implication was clear. Being in Boston would mean being near her, eliminating the cross-country separation that had complicated their growing relationship. That's wonderful, James, Sarah said carefully. But it's a massive decision for your company, your life. I wouldn't want to influence you unduly. You influence me by existing, Sarah, he replied simply. By being exactly who you are. That influence isn't something either of us can control at this point. He squeezed her hand gently. But I want to be clear. I'm not asking you to make any reciprocal decisions right now. This move makes sense for Kat regardless. It would simply open possibilities for us, remove some of the logistical barriers we've been navigating. Sarah nodded, understanding what he wasn't explicitly saying, that if their relationship continued to deepen, if they chose to build a life together, Boston would provide the foundation for that shared future. When would this happen? She asked. The initial setup would begin in about 4 months. My personal relocation would likely be in the early fall. 4 months. Sarah's mind raced with implications, possibilities, questions about what this might mean for them. But she tempered her reaction, knowing this visit was meant to give them time together, space to explore their connection without the pressure of screens and time zones separating them. It's a lot to process, she said finally. But I'm happy for you, James. It sounds like an incredible opportunity. It is. He lifted her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. But we have a week together before such weighty matters need decisions. Let's enjoy California first, shall we? The week unfolded like a dream. Explorations of James's favorite places in the Bay Area, meals at restaurants ranging from Michelin-starred establishments to hole-in-the-wall taquerias, quiet evenings talking on his patio as the marine layer rolled in. James had arranged everything with characteristic thoughtfulness, ensuring accessibility while introducing Sarah to experiences that reflected his life in California. They visited the Callaway Adaptive Technologies headquarters, where Sarah met the team developing the technologies she'd heard so much about. They spent a day in wine country, reminiscent of their dinner at Sarah during Ellie's wedding weekend. They walked and wheeled along oceanside paths, watching waves crash against rugged cliffs as seabirds wheeled overhead. Throughout it all, their connection deepened. The easy conversation that had marked their relationship from the beginning continued, but was now enhanced by a physical comfort with each other. Casual touches, held hands, kisses that grew increasingly familiar, yet no less affecting. On their final evening, James arranged a private dinner on his patio, catered by a local chef who prepared courses showcasing California's seasonal bounty. Candles flickered in hurricane lamps, protecting the flames from the gentle evening breeze, and soft music played from hidden speakers. "This is magical," Sarah said, looking around at the transformed space. "Thank you for a wonderful week, James." "Thank you for coming," he replied, "for taking time away from your patients, your routine." He hesitated, then added, "Being with you these past days has confirmed what I suspected in Boston, what I first sensed on that flight, that there's something rare between us, something worth rearranging life for." Sarah felt the truth of his words resonate within her. Their time together had solidified her own feelings, moving her from initial attraction and interest to something deeper, more certain. She thought of Gladys's words about refusing love out of fear, of her father's story about knowing immediately that her mother was right for him. "I've felt it too," she acknowledged softly. "Even when my practical mind resists, there's something undeniable about us, about how we fit together." James reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box, placing it on the table between them. Sarah's pulse quickened. "This isn't a proposal," he clarified quickly. At least not the kind I impulsively offered on the plane. He smiled ruefully at the memory. It's a promise and a question. Sarah looked at the box, then back to his face, waiting. The promise is this. I will move to Boston, establish the new center, create a life there, regardless of your answer to my question. Your freedom to choose is essential. I would never want you to feel pressured by my decisions. He opened the box, revealing not an engagement ring as she had half expected, but a delicate silver key. The question is whether you would consider moving in with me when I relocate. Not marriage, not yet, though I haven't abandoned that hope entirely. His eyes crinkled with gentle humor. But sharing a home, building a daily life together, seeing if what we've begun these past months can flourish with proximity rather than distance. Sarah looked at the key glinting in the candlelight. It represented exactly the middle path she had been secretly contemplating, more commitment than their current long-distance arrangement, but less than the immediate marriage James had first proposed. A chance to truly know each other in the rhythms of daily life, to learn what a shared future might entail. The house isn't purchased yet, James continued when she didn't immediately respond. We would choose it together, ensure it meets both our needs. Your work at Meadowbrook is important. I would never ask you to give that up. Sarah reached for the key, holding it in her palm, feeling its weight and possibility. James, she began carefully, your condition will progress, he finished for her. Yes, and eventually, the dynamics between us will shift. I will need more care, more accommodation. His gaze was steady, unflinching. I understand what I'm asking, Sarah. I've thought about it carefully, about whether it's fair to invite you into a future that will inevitably include my decline. That's not what concerns me, Sarah corrected gently. I'm a nurse, James. I understand progressive conditions. I've cared for people through their final chapters. What I was going to say is that your condition makes every moment more precious, more vital. She closed her fingers around the key, decision made. Yes, when you move to Boston, I want to share a home with you. The joy that transformed his face was answer enough to any lingering doubts. He reached across the table and she met him halfway, their hands clasping tightly, the key pressed between their palms like a talisman. It won't always be easy, he said, acknowledging the reality they both understood. Few things worth having are, Sarah replied, but we'll figure it out together. As darkness settled over the California landscape, they talked late into the night, planning their shared future with both practical consideration and hopeful anticipation. They were under no illusions about the challenges ahead, the progression of his condition, the adjustments to living together after independent lives, the inevitable disagreements and compromises of any partnership. But there was also joy in their planning, a deep certainty that whatever came, they would face it with the same connection that had sparked on an airplane 3 months ago. A recognition of something essential in each other, something worth pursuing despite every rational argument against it. Sarah would return to Boston tomorrow, to her apartment and her patients at Meadowbrook. James would remain in California to begin the complex process of relocating his company. For a while longer, they would continue their cross-country relationship through calls and visits. But a new future was taking shape, one neither of them had imagined before a seat change on a flight to San Francisco brought them together. A future where the humble woman who had sat next to a man in a wheelchair, thinking it would be just another flight, would build a life with the man who had turned to her and said he wanted to marry her, changing everything in a heartbeat. Sometimes, Sarah reflected as she held James's hand across the table, life's most precious gifts arrived in the most unexpected packaging. The key to happiness, it seemed, had been on an airplane all along. She just hadn't known to look for it, until a stranger with blue eyes and an impossible proposal showed her what was possible when you opened your heart to the unexpected.